There's a world beneath the world you know, a world so ancient, so fundamentally alien, that if you could stand within it, you would not recognize a single living thing around you. The sky above you would be the wrong color, the air would carry the wrong smell, the sounds, or the absence of them, would be nothing like anything your ears have ever processed. And the ocean, that vast, dark, churning body of water that covers most of this planet, would be filled with creatures so bizarre, so magnificently strange, that your mind would struggle to accept that they were real, that they were alive, that they were the architects of everything that came after them, including you. This is not a story about dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, as magnificent as they were, came late to this planet. By the time the first dinosaur took its first breath, life on Earth had already been experimenting, adapting, surviving, dying, and reinventing itself for billions of years. This is the story of those billions of years. This is the story of the oceans that teemed with life before a single footprint had ever been pressed into land. This is the story of the creatures that crawled, swam, floated, and hunted in a world so different from our own that it deserves to be called another planet entirely. This is the story of Earth's lost worlds, and it begins not with a bang but with a stillness so complete, so absolute, that it is almost impossible to imagine. A stillness that lasted for billions of years before life, in all its stubborn, magnificent insistence on existing, decided to change everything. To understand where life came from, you have to first understand what the early Earth actually looked like, and the honest answer is that it looked like nothing hospitable. It looked like nothing welcoming. It looked, in fact, like a vision of a world designed specifically to prevent life from ever taking hold. The Earth formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago from the collision and accumulation of cosmic debris, rock, ice, metal, and gas, swirling around a young sun that had itself only recently ignited. For the first several hundred million years of its existence, our planet was not a world in any meaningful sense. It was a roiling, churning ball of molten rock, bombarded constantly by asteroids and comets, its surface a landscape of volcanic fury and superheated chaos. There was no solid ground to stand on. There were no oceans. There was barely an atmosphere worth mentioning, just clouds of toxic gas belching up from the volcanic activity below, a thin and poisonous shroud around a planet that seemed to be doing everything in its power to destroy itself. This period, known to geologists as the Hadean Eon, lasted from the formation of the Earth until roughly 4 billion years ago. The name itself is telling. It comes from Hades, the ancient Greek underworld, because the early Earth resembled, in almost every conceivable way, a vision of hell. Temperatures at the surface were extraordinarily high. Volcanic eruptions were constant and global in scale. The sky, when it could be seen through the clouds of steam and ash and toxic gas, was not blue but a deep, bruised orange, lit by a sun that was actually somewhat dimmer than it is today, but whose light was filtered through an atmosphere that made the surface hotter than you might expect. And yet, within this chaos, something remarkable was happening. The planet was cooling. Slowly, incrementally, over millions of years, the surface began to solidify. The volcanic activity, while still intense, began to settle into patterns rather than being a constant global catastrophe. And perhaps most importantly, water began to accumulate on the surface. Where did this water come from? This is a question that scientists have debated for decades, and the honest answer is that it probably came from multiple sources. Some of it came from within the Earth itself, released through volcanic activity in the form of water vapor that then condensed as the surface cooled. Some of it likely arrived from space, carried by the comets and water-rich asteroids that continued to bombard the young Earth even as it was cooling. Wherever it came from, the result was transformative. As the surface temperature dropped below the boiling point of water, the steam that had been part of the early atmosphere began to fall as rain. And it rained for a very long time. It rained for thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands of years, an unimaginable deluge that slowly filled the low-lying basins of the cooling crust with liquid water. The first oceans were not vast, calm expanses of blue water. They were shallow, turbulent, superheated pools and seas, probably slightly acidic, constantly agitated by volcanic activity, colored not blue but perhaps a deep red or green by the chemical composition of the water and the minerals dissolved within it. But they were oceans. They were liquid water covering a significant portion of the planet's surface. And liquid water, as scientists have come to understand, is essentially a prerequisite for life as we know it. By approximately 4 billion years ago, perhaps a little earlier, perhaps a little later, the precise date is still a matter of scientific investigation. Something extraordinary happened in those early oceans. Something that we do not fully understand even today. Something that, in retrospect, was the single most important event in the entire history of this planet. Life began. How life began is one of the great unanswered questions of science. We know that it happened. We can trace the thread of biological history back through billions of years of fossil evidence and genetic analysis to a common ancestor, a single point of origin from which all life on Earth is descended. But the precise mechanism by which non-living chemistry became living biology remains one of the deepest mysteries that science has ever confronted. What we do know is that the building blocks of life, the organic molecules, the amino acids, the nucleotides that form the basis of DNA and RNA, are not particularly rare in the universe. They have been found in meteorites. They have been detected in interstellar clouds of gas and dust. They can be produced through relatively simple chemical reactions when the right ingredients are combined under the right conditions. The early Earth, with its rich chemical soup of an ocean and its constant energy inputs from volcanic activity, from lightning, from ultraviolet radiation from the sun, was in many ways an ideal laboratory for producing these building blocks. But producing the building blocks of life is not the same as producing life itself. Life requires not just molecules but organization, a way of packaging chemistry into a system that can maintain itself, that can take in energy from the environment, that can make copies of itself, and that can change over time in response to environmental pressures. How that organization first arose, how the first cell-like structures formed, how the first genetic code came to be written, these are questions that science is still actively investigating. What we know for certain is that by approximately 3.5 billion years ago, and possibly earlier, life existed on Earth. We know this because we have found the fossils, not the fossils of complex creatures, nothing so dramatic as that. What we have found are stromatolites, layered structures formed by communities of single-celled organisms called cyanobacteria, preserved in ancient rocks. These stromatolites represent the oldest clear evidence of life on Earth, mats of microbes growing in the shallow, sunlit waters of the early ocean, doing something that would, over billions of years, fundamentally transform the planet. They were photosynthesizing. Photosynthesis, the process by which organisms convert sunlight and carbon dioxide into energy, releasing oxygen as a byproduct, is so commonplace today that we rarely stop to appreciate how revolutionary it was when it first evolved. The early Earth's atmosphere contained very little free oxygen. The air was mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide, with traces of other gases, and the ocean chemistry reflected this oxygen-poor environment. Life in those early oceans was adapted to this anoxic world. The first microbes drew their energy from chemical reactions that did not require oxygen. But the cyanobacteria changed everything. As they spread across the shallow, sunlit margins of the early ocean, they pumped oxygen into the water and eventually into the atmosphere. This was not a rapid process. It unfolded over hundreds of millions of years, a slow and relentless transformation of the planetary atmosphere. And it was not an unambiguously positive development for the life that already existed. For the microbes that had evolved in an oxygen-free environment, the rising oxygen levels were catastrophic, a global pollution event from their perspective. Many died. Some retreated to oxygen-free refuges deep in the sediment or in anaerobic pockets where they still survive today. But for the history of complex life, this great oxygenation event, which reached its first major peak roughly 2.25 billion years ago, was perhaps the most important development since life itself began. Oxygen, it turns out, is an extraordinarily useful molecule for complex biology. It enables aerobic respiration, a far more efficient way of extracting energy from food than the anaerobic processes that preceded it. And more efficient energy extraction means the possibility of more complex organisms, cells that could afford to build elaborate internal machinery, that could grow larger, that could develop specializations. But even with oxygen accumulating in the atmosphere, the journey to complex life was not a straight line. It was slow, interrupted, and punctuated by catastrophes that make the challenges faced by any individual creature seem trivial by comparison. For the vast majority of Earth's history, life remained small, microscopic, invisible to any eye that might have observed it. For more than 2 billion years after life first appeared, the dominant life forms on Earth were single-celled organisms, bacteria and archaea, simple cells without a nucleus, floating in the ocean, living in the sediment, crusting the rocks of the seafloor in microbial mats. This was not stagnation exactly. These organisms were evolving, diversifying, adapting to every available chemical niche in the environment. But they were not building anything that we would recognize as an ecosystem in any complex sense. There were no predators and prey. There were no arms races between organisms competing for resources. There was chemistry, there was survival, but there was not yet the elaborate drama of complex life. The next great leap came approximately 2 billion years ago with the evolution of a new type of cell, the eukaryotic cell. Unlike bacteria and archaea, eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, a membrane-bound compartment that contains the cell's genetic material. They are substantially larger and more complex than prokaryotic cells, and they carry within them a remarkable secret of their origins. Eukaryotic cells, it appears, are the result of a merger. At some point roughly 2 billion years ago, a large prokaryotic cell engulfed a smaller one, probably a bacterium that was already capable of aerobic respiration. Instead of digesting this smaller cell, the larger cell kept it alive, and over time, the two became inseparable. The engulfed bacterium became what we now call the mitochondrion, the powerhouse of the eukaryotic cell, the organelle responsible for aerobic respiration, for the production of the energy currency that drives all complex life. This remarkable event, which scientists call endosymbiosis, was not a merger of equals negotiating terms. It was almost certainly an accident, a chance encounter that happened to be mutually beneficial, but its consequences were incalculable. With mitochondria providing a dramatically enhanced energy supply, eukaryotic cells could afford to become complex in ways that prokaryotic cells simply could not. They could develop elaborate internal structures, they could grow much larger, and eventually they could do something that changed everything once again. They could cooperate, they could stick together after dividing rather than drifting apart. They could begin to differentiate, with different cells in a cluster taking on different roles. They could become multicellular. The evolution of multicellularity, the organization of many cells into a single coordinated organism, happened multiple times independently in the history of life. Plants, animals, and fungi all evolved multicellularity separately, which tells you something important. Given enough time and the right conditions, evolution will tend to find its way to certain solutions. Multicellularity is one of those solutions because it opens up a staggering range of possibilities that are simply unavailable to single cells. A multicellular organism can be large. It can have specialized parts, cells dedicated to reproduction, cells dedicated to sensing the environment, cells dedicated to movement, cells dedicated to digestion. It can build structures of extraordinary complexity. But the transition to multicellularity was not instantaneous, and for a long time after eukaryotic cells appeared, life remained predominantly microscopic. The fossil record from this period, roughly 2 billion to about 600 million years ago, is dominated by single cells and simple colonial organisms. There are hints of more complex multicellular life in rocks from this period, but they are fragmentary and controversial. For most of this vast expanse of time, which geologists call the Proterozoic Eon, the world would have looked, to our eyes, almost devoid of life in any meaningful sense. But then, as the Proterozoic drew toward its close, something began to change. The world had been through another extraordinary environmental trauma. Between roughly 720 and 635 million years ago, the Earth experienced episodes of glaciation so severe that some researchers have proposed that ice sheets extended all the way to the equator, a condition they call Snowball Earth. Whether the glaciation was truly global or merely near global remains debated, but what is clear is that these were the most extreme ice ages in Earth's history, conditions under which vast stretches of the ocean's surface were frozen and photosynthesis was dramatically curtailed. Life survived, it must have, because it was still here afterward, but it was pushed to extremes, concentrated in whatever refuges remained accessible, driven to the edge of extinction multiple times. And then the ice melted, and when it did, the world that emerged from those glaciations was different from the world that had entered them. The chemistry of the oceans had changed, the atmosphere had changed, and life, having survived the most severe environmental test it had yet faced, was about to take its next great leap. The first complex multicellular animals appear in the fossil record around 580 to 540 million years ago, in a period that paleontologists call the Ediacaran, named for the Ediacaran Hills in Australia, where some of the most remarkable fossils from this period were first discovered. And the creatures preserved in those rocks are extraordinary, not for being recognizable, but for being almost entirely unrecognizable. The Ediacaran fauna, as they are collectively known, are among the most mysterious creatures in the entire history of life. They are large, some of them are tens of centimeters long, large enough to be clearly visible to the naked eye. They are multicellular and complex in the sense that they have distinct structures, distinct shapes, distinct patterns of organization, but they do not obviously belong to any group of animals that exists today. They are not the ancestors of fish or arthropods or mollusks or worms, or at least, if they are, the relationship is deeply unclear. What they look like, these Ediacaran organisms, are quilted mattresses. They look like fronds, they look like discs, they look like branching networks of tubes or like geometric patterns pressed into the seafloor sediment. One of the most famous of them, Dickinsonia, is a flat, oval-shaped creature with a series of ribs running across its body, looking something like a bath mat. It grew up to nearly 1.5 meters in length. It had no mouth, no eyes, no obvious means of locomotion in its earlier forms. It may have absorbed nutrients directly through its body's surface, lying on the microbial mats that covered the seafloor and digesting them by direct contact. Charnia was a frond-like organism, branching and plant-like in appearance, anchored to the seafloor and extending upward into the water. For a long time after its discovery, scientists argued about whether it was an animal at all, or perhaps a type of alga or even a colony of microbes. The debate continues. Kimberella was different, slightly more recognizable in the sense that it had a clear front and back, a clear directionality. It seems to have moved across the seafloor, scraping at microbial mats with some kind of flexible structure at its front end. If this interpretation is correct, Kimberella may be one of the earliest animals we know of that actively sought out food and moved to obtain it, a behavioral complexity that seems small but represents an enormous leap from simply absorbing nutrients passively. What united the Ediacaran fauna as a community was their apparent gentleness. This was an ecosystem without obvious predation, or at least without the kind of high-energy active predation that would come later. There were no jaws, no claws, no obvious weapons of attack or obvious structures of defense. The organisms of the Ediacaran world seem to have been, by and large, filter feeders, mat grazers, and suspension feeders, organisms that extracted nutrients from the water or the sediment without the drama of pursuit and capture. This was a world of extraordinary alien beauty, if you could have seen it. The seafloor in the shallow, well-lit waters where Ediacaran life was most abundant would have been carpeted in a living tapestry of form and texture, fronds waving gently in the current, quilted mats clinging to the substrate, discs anchored to the rock. the whole assembly organized not by competition and predation, but by a gentler kind of ecological arrangement. It was a world without arms races. A world without the constant, grinding pressure of predation that would come to define animal life in all the eons that followed. And then, around 540 million years ago, it ended. Not in a sudden extinction event, or not obviously so, but in a transformation so profound that it rewrote the rules of life on Earth entirely. The Cambrian Explosion is one of the most debated and fascinating events in the history of life. Its name is somewhat misleading. It was not instantaneous by human standards. It unfolded over a period of tens of millions of years, from roughly 540 million years ago to about 485 million years ago, during the Cambrian period at the start of what geologists call the Paleozoic era. But by geological standards, it was extraordinarily rapid. Within this window of time, the fossil record transforms from something dominated by the soft-bodied, mysterious creatures of the Ediacaran into something that looks, for the first time, recognizably modern in its ecological structure. Why did this happen? What drove the Cambrian explosion? Paleontologists and evolutionary biologists have been arguing about this question for over a century, and the honest answer is that we do not have a single, agreed-upon explanation. Several factors probably contributed, interacting with one another in complex ways. One factor was environmental. The oxygen content of the atmosphere and oceans had been rising, and by the beginning of the Cambrian, it may have crossed a threshold that made it possible for larger, more metabolically active animals to survive. Bigger bodies with more complex physiology require more oxygen, and if the ocean chemistry of the Ediacaran was not quite oxygen-rich enough to support them, then the increasing oxygenation of the oceans in the late Precambrian might have unlocked the possibility of larger, more active animal life. Another factor was evolutionary. The evolution of certain key innovations, eyes, jaws, hard shells, sophisticated nervous systems, may have triggered a kind of cascade of evolutionary change. Once eyes evolved, for instance, the dynamic between predator and prey changed fundamentally. A predator that can see its prey has an enormous advantage over one that cannot. A prey animal that can see a predator has an enormous advantage in terms of escape. The evolution of eyes immediately creates an intense selective pressure for better camouflage, faster movement, harder shells, sharper senses, and all of these adaptations, once they begin to evolve in some lineages, create selective pressures for counter-adaptations in others. This is what biologists call an evolutionary arms race, and once it begins, it tends to accelerate. The third factor may have been geological. The Cambrian period began with the breakup of a supercontinent, which flooded continental margins with shallow, warm seas, exactly the kind of environment that is most productive for marine life. More habitat means more opportunity for ecological diversification. Whatever the precise causes, the result was breathtaking. Within the span of a few tens of millions of years, the oceans went from being dominated by the soft, strange organisms of the Ediacaran to being filled with an astonishing diversity of animals belonging to most of the major body plans, the major structural blueprints that exist in the animal kingdom today. And then some. The most extraordinary window into the Cambrian explosion comes from a series of fossil sites around the world that preserve, with almost miraculous fidelity, not just the hard parts of animals, shells, teeth, mineralized skeletons, but the soft tissues as well. The most famous of these sites is the Burgess Shale, a deposit of fine-grained shale in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, first discovered in 1909 by the paleontologist Charles Walcott, and subsequently revealed through decades of careful excavation and analysis to be one of the most important fossil deposits ever found. The Burgess Shale was formed in the Middle Cambrian, roughly 508 million years ago, in what was then a warm, shallow tropical sea. Organisms living at the edge of an underwater cliff periodically fell or were carried into deeper, oxygen-poor water below, where they were rapidly buried in fine sediment and preserved with extraordinary detail. In the Burgess Shale, you can see the gut of an ancient animal. You can see the outline of its eyes. You can see the delicate filaments of its gills. You can see in some specimens what it had for its last meal, preserved as a dark smear within its fossilized digestive system. What the Burgess Shale revealed to the scientists who studied it in detail, particularly the paleontologist Harry Whittington and his students Simon Conway Morris and Derek Briggs, who undertook the comprehensive re-examination of the Walcott collection in the 1970s and 1980s, was a world of almost incomprehensible diversity and strangeness. There were creatures in the Burgess Shale that fit neatly into recognizable categories. There were early relatives of modern arthropods, the group that today includes insects, spiders, crabs, and their kin. There were early worms, early mollusks, early echinoderms, relatives of modern starfish and sea urchins. There were the ancestors of the vertebrates, the backboned animals that would eventually give rise to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. But there were also creatures that fit into no recognizable category whatsoever. Creatures so bizarre, so unlike anything alive today or at any other point in the fossil record, that they posed a genuine challenge to the scientific imagination. And among the most extraordinary of these were two animals that have become, in the decades since their rediscovery and reinterpretation, icons of the Cambrian world. Picture an ocean floor in the shallow tropics 500 million years ago. The water is warm and clear, lit from above by sunlight filtering through the surface. The seafloor is covered in a complex community of organisms. Sponges of various kinds anchor themselves to the rock, their bodies riddled with tiny pores through which they filter seawater for nutrients. Worm-like creatures move through the sediment. Small, armored animals with many legs pick their way across the bottom. And threading through it all, patrolling the water column above the seafloor, is an animal unlike anything that exists on Earth today. It is not small. By the standards of Cambrian life, it is enormous, up to a meter in length, perhaps longer in some estimates. It swims with a rippling, fluid grace, its body flattened and flexible, its edges fringed with overlapping lobes that undulate in waves to propel it through the water. At its front end, two long, segmented appendages reach forward, flexible and grasping, capable of seizing prey and drawing it toward a circular mouth ringed with a series of hard plates that open and close like an iris. Its eyes are large and compound, mounted on stalks, giving it a wide field of vision that makes it difficult to approach undetected. This is Anomalocaris, which means in Latin abnormal shrimp, and it was the apex predator of its world. In an ecosystem where most animals measured in millimeters or, at most, a few centimeters, Anomalocaris was a giant. It was fast, it was mobile, it had excellent vision, and it had the grasping appendages and the circular, reinforced mouth necessary to capture and process prey that was actively resisting capture. It was, in every meaningful sense, a revolutionary organism, the first large, active, complex predator in the history of animal life. The discovery and reinterpretation of Anomalocaris is itself a fascinating story. Its various parts were found independently and for decades described as entirely separate animals. The circular mouth plates were initially identified as a species of jellyfish. The grasping appendages were described as the tail of a shrimp, giving the animal its misleading name because they were actually part of the head. It was not until the 1980s that paleontologists, examining complete specimens from the Burgess Shale and other Cambrian deposits, realized that these apparently separate fossils were all parts of the same extraordinary creature, and Anomalocaris was not alone. It belonged to a larger group of animals called the radiodonts, whose members included several other large predatory forms with varying body plans, different appendage structures, and possibly different dietary specializations. Some radiodonts, based on the structure of their frontal appendages, may have been filter feeders rather than active predators, giants that swam through the water with their mouth parts spread wide, straining plankton from the current rather than hunting individual prey. The diversity of body plans within this single group, all derived from the same basic blueprint, gives you a sense of the ecological experimentation that was underway in Cambrian seas. But for sheer improbability of appearance, for the quality of making you question whether you are looking at a real organism or a hallucination, nothing from the Cambrian quite matches Hallucigenia. Hallucigenia is a small animal. Most specimens are only a few centimeters long, preserved in the Burgess Shale and a handful of other Cambrian deposits. Its name was given to it by the paleontologist Simon Conway Morris in 1977, and the name tells you everything you need to know about the first impression it makes on a scientist trying to make sense of it. It is named for hallucinations. It is named for the quality of seeming too strange to be real. The original interpretation of Hallucigenia, based on the specimens available in the 1970s, placed the animal walking on a series of long, stiff spines, 7 pairs of them, while a series of tentacle-like appendages extended upward from its back. It had apparently a cylindrical body with no obvious head or tail, supported on stilts of rigid spines with waving tentacles on top. No modern animal looks remotely like this. No modern animal provides any template for making sense of it. Scientists examining the original description were uncertain whether the head end was the end they thought was the head, or whether the spines were on the bottom or the top, or whether the tentacles were for feeding or for locomotion. It turned out that the original interpretation had the animal upside down. The spines were on the back, not the bottom. They were defensive structures, a row of sharp, rigid points that would have made Hallucigenia difficult to swallow for any predator that tried to take it from above. The tentacle-like appendages were actually legs, 7 pairs of soft, flexible limbs on which the animal walked across the seafloor. And with better specimens came better understanding of the head, a rounded end with a pair of eyes and a circular mouth, surrounded by a ring of small teeth. With this correction, Hallucigenia becomes more comprehensible, but only slightly. It is still a creature without a modern equivalent, still something that belongs to a world of body plans that have been entirely replaced. It belongs to a group of animals called the Lobopodians, sometimes called the velvet worms, after their modern relatives, creatures with soft, stubby legs that represent an evolutionary grade between the simple body plan of a worm and the more complex, articulated body plan of the arthropods. Modern velvet worms, which live in tropical forests and hunt insects and other small prey, are the closest living relatives of Hallucigenia and its kin. They are, in a real sense, living fossils of a kind, the surviving representatives of a body plan that was once far more diverse and far more prevalent. The spines on Hallucigenia's back are particularly interesting because they reveal something important about the ecological context of the Cambrian world. Defense against predation, specifically armoring and armament against being eaten, is one of the hallmarks of the Cambrian Explosion. Before this period, as we noted, the Ediacaran world shows little evidence of predation in the modern sense. The Cambrian world, by contrast, shows it everywhere. Organisms have shells, organisms have spines, organisms have eyes to detect threats. Organisms have the ability to retreat rapidly into burrows or to withdraw into protective coverings. The Cambrian was when predation became the defining ecological force in animal evolution, and the response to predation, the defensive arms race, is written into the body plans of virtually every animal that lived in those ancient seas. Among the most successful and most recognizable animals to emerge from this period of explosive diversification were the Trilobites. They deserve special attention because they were not merely successful, they were extraordinarily successful in a way that few groups of animals in Earth's history have ever matched. Trilobites were arthropods, members of the same great group that today includes insects, spiders, crustaceans, and millipedes. Like all arthropods, they had a hard external skeleton, jointed legs, and segmented bodies. But their particular body plan was distinctive and immediately recognizable. A flattened, oval body divided into 3 sections from front to back, a head shield, a segmented thorax, and a rear section called the pygidium, and also divided into 3 lobes from side to side, the central lobe running down the middle flanked by two lateral lobes on either side. This three-lobed organization gives them their name. What makes the trilobites so remarkable is not just their distinctive appearance, but the sheer duration and scope of their success. They first appeared in the fossil record very early in the Cambrian period, around 521 million years ago, and they persisted, evolving, diversifying, changing, until the end of the Permian period, roughly 252 million years ago. That is a run of almost 270 million years, more than 3 times as long as the entire existence of dinosaurs. In that time, they diversified into thousands of species, filling virtually every available ecological niche in the marine environment. There were tiny trilobites smaller than a fingernail. There were giants more than 70 centimeters long. There were trilobites that swam in open water. There were trilobites that burrowed in the sediment. There were trilobites that were specialized predators, and trilobites that were filter feeders, and trilobites that scavenged the seafloor for organic debris. And they had eyes. This is perhaps the most immediately striking feature of the trilobites, their eyes, which were in many species extraordinarily well developed. Trilobite eyes were compound eyes, similar in basic structure to the eyes of modern insects and crustaceans, built from hundreds or thousands of individual lenses that together gave the animal a wide field of view. But trilobite eyes had a unique feature not found in any living animal today. The lenses were made of calcite, the mineral that makes up limestone. Calcite crystals have optical properties that make them capable of functioning as lenses, and in some trilobite species, the arrangement of the calcite lenses was so precisely organized that it corrected for the kinds of optical aberrations that would otherwise plague a compound eye of that design. In other words, trilobites had eyes that were, in some respects, optically sophisticated in ways that modern biologists still find impressive. The trilobite eye has been studied by optical physicists who have pointed out that the arrangement of lenses in some species minimizes spherical aberration in a way that is mathematically elegant, a solution that was arrived at independently by certain 17th century optical researchers working on lens design. Evolution had solved this optical problem 500 million years before human engineers worked out the mathematics. The world that the trilobites inhabited was not static. Through the Cambrian and into the subsequent Ordovician period, which lasted from approximately 485 to 444 million years ago, the oceans were changing, the continents were shifting, and life was diversifying with extraordinary speed and creativity. The Ordovician period saw what paleontologists call the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, arguably the most dramatic increase in the diversity of marine life in the history of the planet. The number of marine animal families roughly tripled during this period, as new ecological niches opened up and new body plans appeared. The Ordovician Ocean was in many ways the first ocean that would have looked somewhat recognizable to a modern eye, not because the individual organisms resembled modern marine life, but because the ecological structure was becoming familiar. There were predators and prey. There were organisms occupying different levels of the food web. There were reef-like structures built by sponges and stromatoporoids and early corals, providing complex three-dimensional habitat that in turn supported greater biodiversity. There were swimmers and walkers and burrowers and drifters, each adapted to their particular way of making a living in the marine environment. Among the most spectacular of the Ordovician predators were the nautiloids, relatives of the modern nautilus, but in forms that would be unrecognizable compared to their living descendants. Ordovician nautiloids included not just the familiar coiled shell form, but straight-shelled cephalopods that could reach extraordinary sizes. Some of these straight-shelled nautiloids, known as orthosradids, may have reached lengths of several meters, making them the largest animals in the Ordovician Ocean, sitting at the apex of the food web and casting a metabolic shadow over the ecosystems below. Picture an Ordovician reef. The water is warm, shallow, clear. Light filters through it in shifting columns. The reef itself is built not from the coral that dominates modern reefs, but from a complex community of tabulate and rugose corals, stromatoporoids, bryozoans, and crinoids, the latter with their feathery arms extended into the current, filter feeding on the plankton that drifts past them in endless supply. Among the reef structures, trilobites pick their way across the substrate. Brachiopods, shelled animals that look something like clams but are entirely unrelated to them, anchor themselves to the rock, their shells opening periodically to filter water for food. And above the reef, moving through the open water, the sleek, conical forms of nautiloids patrol, their tentacles trailing below them, ready to seize any creature unwary enough to come within reach. This was a world of genuine complexity, a world where the interactions between organisms had become intricate and multidimensional in ways that had not existed before the Cambrian. And yet it was still, in one very important sense, incomplete. All of this life, all of this extraordinary diversity of form and function was confined to the ocean. The land, stretching in vast, barren expanses beyond the reach of the sea, was still empty, not entirely empty. There were microbes on the land, probably, and perhaps some simple early plants in the form of algae near the water's edge. But there were no animals on the land, no footprints pressed into the soil, no creatures moving through the air. The continents were lifeless rock, their surfaces exposed to ultraviolet radiation, to erosion, to the simple chemistry of rock and water and air, without the mediating influence of living things. That would change. But before it did, the ocean world would first have to survive a crisis. The end of the Ordovician period, roughly 444 million years ago, brought one of the most significant mass extinctions in the history of life. It was the second largest mass extinction by some measures. Only the extinction at the end of the Permian, which we will come to in due course, killed a higher percentage of marine species. In the late Ordovician extinction, approximately 85% of all marine species were wiped out. The cause was a dramatic shift in climate, specifically, a rapid cooling of the Earth that resulted in the growth of ice sheets over the southern continent of Gondwana, which at that time was positioned near the South Pole. As the ice sheets grew, sea levels fell dramatically because vast quantities of water were locked up in ice rather than flowing into the ocean. Shallow water marine environments, which had been some of the most biodiverse habitats on the planet, dried up or shrank dramatically. The chemistry of the ocean water changed. The ecological communities that had been developing for tens of millions of years collapsed, and then the ice melted, rapidly by geological standards. As the climate swung back, sea levels rose again, and the returning waters were warmer but also poorer in oxygen, conditions that created widespread dead zones in the ocean where little could survive. This double punch, glaciation followed by rapid warming and ocean anoxia, was devastating. But life survived. It always survives, or at least some of it always survives. From the wreckage of the late Ordovician extinction, the survivors began to rebuild. The Silurian period, which followed the Ordovician from approximately 444 to 419 million years ago, was in many ways a time of recovery and innovation. The reefs returned, rebuilt by coral communities that had adapted to the new ocean chemistry. The trilobites recovered, though they never quite reached the diversity they had achieved in the Ordovician. New groups of fish diversified in the Silurian ocean, some of them armored with bony plates, others bearing the first hints of the jaws that would eventually make the vertebrate body plan such an extraordinarily versatile tool for ecological conquest. And in the Silurian, something else happened, something that would change everything. Life began to move onto land. The colonization of land by complex life is one of the most important transitions in the history of this planet. It was not a sudden event, it was a gradual process, unfolding over millions of years, involving many different groups of organisms independently solving the same set of fundamental problems. And the problems were formidable. The ocean is in many ways an extraordinarily convenient place to live. Water is buoyant, it supports the body weight of aquatic organisms, meaning that they do not need heavy, rigid skeletons to hold themselves up. Water carries away waste products and delivers dissolved oxygen to respiratory organs. Water provides a medium for fertilization and reproduction. Water moderates temperature changes because it has a high heat capacity and changes temperature much more slowly than air. For organisms adapted to aquatic life, the ocean is not just a habitat, it is a life support system that handles many of the most basic challenges of survival automatically. Land offers none of these conveniences. Land gravity is an unmitigated problem without water's buoyancy. Every organism must support its own weight through muscular effort or rigid skeletal structures. On land, desiccation, the loss of water from body tissues, is a constant threat because the air is dry and the body surface is exposed to evaporation. On land, gas exchange breathing requires specialized organs because gills, which work by extracting dissolved oxygen from water flowing over them, are useless in air. On land, reproduction requires special adaptations because the eggs and sperm that aquatic organisms release into the surrounding water cannot simply be scattered into the environment without drying out instantly. These are not trivial challenges. They required solutions of considerable evolutionary ingenuity, and the first organisms to solve them were not animals but plants. The fossil record suggests that the first land plants appeared in the Ordovician period, around 470 million years ago, though the earliest clear macroscopic plant fossils come from the Silurian. These earliest land plants were small, simple structures, lacking roots, lacking leaves, lacking the complex vascular systems that carry water and nutrients through the bodies of modern plants. They were, in essence, descendants of green algae that had found a way to survive at the edge of the water, where tidal fluctuations or seasonal changes in water level periodically exposed them to air. The key adaptations for terrestrial life in plants were, in simplest terms, a waxy coating on the outer surface to prevent water loss, pores called stomata that could be opened and closed to control gas exchange and water retention, and structures to support the plant body against gravity. Over time, as the Silurian gave way to the Devonian period, which lasted from approximately 419 to 359 million years ago, land plants became increasingly elaborate. They developed vascular tissues, the internal plumbing that allowed them to draw water up from the soil and distribute it through their bodies. They developed true roots that anchored them to the soil and extended their reach for water and nutrients. And they began to grow tall, reaching upward toward the light, competing with neighboring plants for access to the sun's energy. The earliest forests appeared toward the end of the Devonian period. The trees of these first forests were nothing like modern trees. They had odd, sometimes branching trunks, strange leaf arrangements, reproduction by spores rather than seeds. But they were undeniably forests, tall, dense, complex communities of plant life covering what had previously been bare rock and sediment. And where there were plants, there was food for animals, and where there was food, animals would eventually follow. The first animals to venture onto land were the arthropods. This makes sense from a structural standpoint. Arthropods already had an exoskeleton that served as a protective outer covering, limiting water loss. They already had jointed legs capable of supporting their body weight. They already had respiratory systems that in some groups could be modified to extract oxygen from air rather than water. The earliest evidence of land-dwelling arthropods comes from trace fossils, the tracks and burrows of creatures moving across ancient landscapes, dating to the Ordovician and Silurian periods. By the Silurian, there were definitely arthropods living on land or in the zone between water and land. These were probably relatives of modern millipedes, centipedes, and the ancient arachnids, the group that would eventually give rise to spiders, scorpions, and their kin. Among the most important early land dwellers were creatures called eurypterids, and while they are often described as sea scorpions, this name is something of a misnomer on both counts. They were not true scorpions, though they were related to them, and they did not live exclusively in the sea. Eurypterids were aquatic arthropods, that much is true. They evolved in marine environments, and many species spent their lives in salt water. but some Eurypterid lineages over the course of the Silurian and Devonian periods made the transition to brackish water and eventually to freshwater and perhaps to periodic excursions onto land. Eurypterids ranged enormously in size. Some were small, just a few centimeters long. Others were among the largest arthropods in Earth's history. Echolopterus, known from fragmentary remains, may have reached over 2.5 meters in length, making it roughly the size of a large crocodile. These giants would have been formidable predators in any aquatic environment, and the possibility that some of them could move, however clumsily, onto land is a sobering thought. The Eurypterid body plan consisted of a broad, flat head shield bearing eyes, a segmented body, a series of walking legs, and at the tail end, a long pointed telson, in some species, a stinger. They were active, mobile animals, and some species appear to have been capable predators, armed with large, grasping claws at the front of their bodies for seizing prey. Others were probably less specialized, feeding on whatever organic material they could find. The Eurypterids represent a fascinating transitional moment in the history of life, a group of animals straddling the boundary between fully aquatic and partially terrestrial existence, exploring the margins of the land even as the more dramatic invasion of the terrestrial environment was still developing. They would persist through the Devonian and into the Carboniferous and Permian periods before finally going extinct at the end of the Permian. But the most dramatic and ultimately most consequential invasion of the land was made not by arthropods but by vertebrates. The ancestors of all backbone land animals, all amphibians, all reptiles, all birds, all mammals evolved from fish. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. It is a literal fact of evolutionary history, documented in extraordinary detail by the fossil record. The fish-to-land transition is one of the best documented major transitions in the entire history of life, and the story it tells is one of the most remarkable in biology. Fish first appeared in the Cambrian or Ordovician periods. The earliest clear fish fossils date to around 530 million years ago. These earliest fish were jawless, similar in some ways to modern lampreys and hagfish, and they spent their lives in aquatic environments, filter feeding or parasitically attaching themselves to other organisms. The evolution of jaws, which occurred sometime in the Silurian, was another of those revolutionary innovations that opened up entirely new ecological possibilities. A fish with jaws can bite, it can seize prey, it can process food of a size and hardness that jawless fish cannot manage. The jawed vertebrates, once they appeared, rapidly diversified into a staggering array of forms. In the Devonian period, sometimes called the Age of Fishes, the oceans, rivers, and lakes teemed with vertebrate life in extraordinary variety. There were the placoderms, fish armored with bony plates on their heads and the forward part of their bodies, some of which reached enormous sizes. Dunkleosteus, the largest of the placoderms, had a skull nearly 2 meters long and a body length that may have approached 8 meters. It was one of the most powerful biting animals of all time. Its jaw mechanism, based on a hinge system rather than true teeth, could have exerted a bite force comparable to that of a large modern crocodile. It sat at the apex of the Devonian food web, a true apex predator in the same sense that a great white shark or a killer whale is today. There were the acanthodians, spiny finned fish, sometimes called spiny sharks, though they were not closely related to true sharks. There were the early sharks themselves, which appeared in the Devonian and began the long evolutionary trajectory that continues to the present day. And there were the lobe-finned fish, the group whose significance would not become apparent for some time, but whose thick, muscular fins concealed within them the bones that would eventually become arms and legs. The lobe-finned fish, the Sarcopterygians, are distinguished from the more familiar ray-finned fish, which make up the vast majority of living fish species today, by the structure of their paired fins. In ray-finned fish, the fin is supported by a series of thin bony rays that fan out from the base. In lobe-finned fish, the fin is supported by a series of stout, heavy bones, an arrangement that, in retrospect, is remarkably suggestive of the limb skeleton of terrestrial vertebrates. The bones of the lobe fin correspond in their basic arrangement to the bones of the upper arm, the forearm, the wrist, and the hand of a human being. The significance of this was not apparent in the Devonian, of course. These were still fish, they breathed through gills, they lived in water, they reproduced in water. But some of them had also evolved lungs, primitive air-breathing organs that allowed them to supplement their gill breathing in the warm, shallow, sometimes oxygen-depleted waters that they inhabited. These lungfish, several lineages of which still survive today in the rivers of Africa, South America, and Australia, could breathe air when necessary. Some of them could even survive temporary drought by burrowing into the mud and entering a state of torpor, breathing air through a mucus-sealed tube while waiting for the water to return. And then sometime in the late Devonian, roughly 375 to 365 million years ago, a group of lobe-finned fish began to do something extraordinary. They began to emerge from the water. The evidence for this transition comes from a series of remarkable fossil discoveries that have been made over the past several decades, each one adding detail and nuance to a story that would otherwise be inferential. The most famous of these fossils is Tiktaalik rosie, discovered in 2004 on Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic by a team led by paleontologist Neil Shubin. Tiktaalik was found in rocks approximately 375 million years old, and it is one of the most celebrated transitional fossils in the history of paleontology. It was a lobe-finned fish, clearly. It had scales, gills, and the basic body plan of a large fish. But it also had features that are not fish-like at all, features that are more reminiscent of tetrapods, the four-limbed land vertebrates. It had a neck, a feature that fish do not have, because fish skulls are connected directly to the shoulder girdle without the kind of flexible joint that would allow independent movement of the head. Tiktaalik could turn its head from side to side, a capability that would be essential for any animal trying to navigate on land. Its pectoral fins, the fins corresponding to the front limbs, were thick and muscular, with an internal skeleton that included bones corresponding to the humerus, the radius, and the ulna, the bones of the upper arm and forearm in terrestrial vertebrates. The wrist region was flexible and weight-bearing in a way not seen in other fish. Tiktaalik, it appears, could prop itself up on its front fins and move them in a way more like the movement of a limb than the simple flexing of a fin. It could, in short, do a kind of proto-push-up. It could lift its head and forward body clear of the surface beneath it. Was Tiktaalik walking on land? Probably not in any sustained way. It was still primarily a fish, still dependent on water, still breathing partly through gills. But it represents a moment, a snapshot of an evolutionary process in action when the modifications necessary for terrestrial life were being assembled. The neck that could turn, the fins that could bear weight. The lungs that could breathe air, the flattened body that could navigate shallow water or mudflats. All of these things were already present in Tiktaalik, waiting to be elaborated upon by the lineages that would follow. The animals that followed Tiktaalik in the fossil record are the first true tetrapods, the first animals with four proper limbs rather than fins. Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, found in late Devonian rocks from Greenland, are among the earliest known tetrapods, dating to roughly 365 million years ago. They were clearly more limbed than Tiktaalik. They had actual legs with individual digits, hands, and feet in a recognizable sense, but they were not fully terrestrial. Acanthostega in particular seems to have been primarily aquatic. Its limbs may have been used for maneuvering in water more than for walking on land, and it retained a full complement of gills alongside its lungs. But the trajectory was clear. Over the course of the late Devonian and into the Carboniferous period that followed, the tetrapod lineages were moving toward land, driven by the opportunities that the land presented, the untapped resources, the abundance of plant material and invertebrate prey, the relative freedom from the competition and predation of the aquatic world. The Carboniferous period, which lasted from approximately 359 to 299 million years ago, is sometimes called the Coal Age, because the vast coal deposits that formed the basis of so much industrial energy in the past few centuries were laid down during this period. Those coal deposits are the compressed and transformed remains of the forests of the Carboniferous, forests of extraordinary extent and density that covered the low-lying, swampy landscapes of the tropical regions of Pangaea, the supercontinent that was in the process of assembling itself during this time. The Carboniferous forests were unlike any forests that exist today. They were dominated not by flowering plants or conifers, neither of which had yet evolved, but by tree-sized club mosses, horsetails, and ferns. The trees of the Carboniferous were strange and architecturally unusual, scale trees whose bark was covered in the diamond-patterned scars of fallen leaves, Calamites, giant horsetails that towered over the swampy forest floor, lepidodendron which could reach 30 meters in height and had a distinctive, regularly patterned bark that resembles nothing in the modern world. These forests were dark and humid, their floors perpetually waterlogged, the air rich with moisture and oxygen. The oxygen content of the Carboniferous atmosphere, based on various geological indicators, was substantially higher than it is today, perhaps 35% compared to the 21% of the present atmosphere. This high oxygen level had important ecological consequences. In particular, it may have enabled the extraordinarily large sizes achieved by some Carboniferous arthropods. Arthropods breathe through a system of tubes called tracheae that carry oxygen directly to the tissues, and the effectiveness of this system scales with the oxygen content of the air. Higher oxygen means that larger arthropods can still oxygenate their tissues adequately, and the Carboniferous fossil record includes some remarkable examples. Meganeura was a giant dragonfly, a flying insect with a wingspan of up to 65 centimeters, roughly the wingspan of a modern red-tailed hawk. It was the largest flying insect that has ever lived, and it was an active predator, preying on other insects and perhaps on small vertebrates that were small enough for it to handle. Arthropleura was a millipede-like arthropod that could reach over 2 meters in length, making it the largest land-dwelling invertebrate in Earth's history. It was probably an herbivore, moving through the forest floor vegetation and consuming plant material, a peaceful giant by ecological role, if not by size. The tetrapods of the Carboniferous were still closely tied to the water. The amphibians, the group that descended from the first tetrapods, remained dependent on water for reproduction because their eggs had no protective shell and would dry out if laid on land. They diversified enormously during the Carboniferous into a wide range of body plans, including some surprisingly large forms. Euryalps, which lived in the late Carboniferous and early Permian, was a robust, crocodile-like amphibian that could reach 2 meters in length, a substantial predator for its time, capable of hunting both in the water and on the margins of land. But the amphibians faced a fundamental constraint that limited how far from water they could go and how thoroughly they could exploit the terrestrial environment. Their eggs had to be laid in water. Their larvae had to develop in water. Their skin, while adapted for gas exchange, was permeable and prone to desiccation. They were, in a sense, permanently tethered to the water's edge, unable to move too far from the ponds and swamps that they depended upon for reproduction and for the maintenance of their body water. The solution to this problem was one of the most important evolutionary innovations in the history of land vertebrates, the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg is, in its way, a marvel of biological engineering. It is essentially a portable aquatic environment, a container that maintains the developing embryo in its own private pond, sealed within a series of membranes that prevent water loss and protect the embryo from physical damage, while still allowing gas exchange with the outside air. The membranes within the egg are named after the structures they correspond to in the embryo: the amnion, which surrounds the embryo in fluid, the chorion, which manages gas exchange, the yolk sac, which provides nutrients, and the allantois, which manages waste products. Together, these membranes create an environment in which an embryo can develop entirely on land without any need for external water. The evolution of the amniotic egg represented the final severing of the reproductive dependence on water that had constrained tetrapod evolution. Once an animal could lay its eggs on land without risk of them drying out, the entire terrestrial environment became accessible: the dry uplands, the open plains, the rocky hillsides far from any lake or stream. The animals that carried this innovation, the amniotes, were the ancestors of all modern reptiles, birds, and mammals, and their appearance in the fossil record, sometime in the early Carboniferous or possibly the late Devonian, represents the beginning of the transition to the fully terrestrial way of life. The earliest amniotes were small, lizard-like creatures. They were not impressive by size. They were not dramatic by the standards of the apex predators of their time. But they carried within them, in the form of that revolutionary egg, the potential for everything that would come after. Every reptile, every bird, every mammal, every dinosaur, all of them are descended from those first small, unassuming creatures who figured out how to reproduce on land. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian period, which lasted from approximately 299 to 252 million years ago, the amniotes began to diversify. And they diversified into two great lineages, a division that would shape the history of life for hundreds of millions of years. The Carboniferous rainforest world did not last forever. Around 305 million years ago, the climate began to dry. The vast coal swamps that had dominated the equatorial regions of the assembling supercontinent Pangaea started to fragment and shrink, breaking up into isolated pockets separated by increasingly arid landscapes. This climate shift, sometimes called the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, was catastrophic for many of the species that had evolved in the humid swamp forests. The amphibians, in particular, suffered because their dependence on wet environments meant that the drying of the landscape severely constrained their range and diversity. But for the amniotes, the drying of the landscape was not a crisis, it was an opportunity. The ability to reproduce on land, independent of standing water, suddenly became an enormous advantage in a world where standing water was becoming less abundant and less reliable. The amniotes expanded into the dry uplands and arid landscapes that the amphibians could not follow them into, and in doing so, they encountered a vast set of ecological niches that had never been exploited by vertebrate life. The two great lineages of amniotes, distinguished by the arrangement of openings in the skull behind the eye socket, a technical anatomical detail that has enormous systematic significance, were the synapsids and the sauropsids. The sauropsids are the lineage that leads to modern reptiles and birds. The synapsids are the lineage that leads to modern mammals and to us. In the early Permian, it was the synapsids that were dominant. They had diversified first and most spectacularly, and they occupied the top of the food web in most Permian terrestrial ecosystems. Among the most recognizable of them, the one that has captured the popular imagination most thoroughly, was Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. This cannot be stressed enough because it is one of the most persistent misconceptions in popular accounts of prehistoric life. Dimetrodon lived in the early Permian period, between roughly 295 and 272 million years ago, more than 40 million years before the first dinosaurs appeared. It belonged to the synapsid lineage, which means it was actually more closely related to modern mammals to us than to any dinosaur. If you wanted to draw a simplified family tree, Dimetrodon would be on the branch that leads to humans, while dinosaurs would be on an entirely different branch. But Dimetrodon is, regardless of its proper systematic placement, an extraordinary animal. It was large, some species reached body lengths of over 3 meters, and it was among the largest land predators of its time. It was built for power rather than speed, a robust, heavily muscled animal with strong jaws bearing differentiated teeth, a feature that is unusual among reptile-grade animals but becomes more prominent as you move toward the mammalian lineage. It had apparently a fairly sophisticated bite. The teeth in the front of its mouth were long and conical for seizing prey, while those further back were more blade-like for processing it. But the most immediately striking feature of Dimetrodon was the sail on its back, a tall, dramatic structure built from elongated neural spines extending upward from the vertebrae, connected by a thin skin of tissue. The sail could reach nearly a meter in height in large individuals, giving the animal a silhouette that is immediately recognizable and dramatic. What was the sail for? This has been the subject of considerable debate. The most straightforward hypothesis is thermoregulation. The sail functioned as a radiator or solar panel, allowing the animal to warm up rapidly in the morning by exposing the sail to sunlight, and to shed excess heat by standing in shade or a breeze during the hottest part of the day. The large surface area of the sail, well supplied with blood vessels, would have been efficient at exchanging heat with the environment. If Dimetrodon was not yet fully endothermic, capable of generating its own body heat metabolically, as modern mammals are, then the ability to warm up quickly in the morning by using the sail as a solar absorber would have given it a significant advantage over competitors and prey that could not do the same. Alternative hypotheses have proposed that the sail was primarily for display, for attracting mates or intimidating rivals, or that it served some other social or physiological function. The truth may be a combination of these possibilities. What is clear is that the sail evolved independently in multiple lineages of early synapsids, a pattern that suggests it was providing some genuine adaptive advantage in the conditions of the early Permian world. Dimetrodon shared its world with a remarkable diversity of other synapsids, animals that ranged from large herbivores to small insectivores, filling the ecological roles that we are accustomed to seeing filled by mammals today. There were dicynodonts, stocky herbivores with reduced dentition and a pair of tusk-like canines, whose success was so great that they would eventually come to dominate Permian herbivore communities around the world. There were Gorgonopsids, sleek, powerful predators with large, saber-like canine teeth, sophisticated hunters that represented the pinnacle of synapsid evolution in the Middle and Late Permian. There were Cynodontia, a group of increasingly mammal-like synapsids with evidence of hair, warm blood, and sophisticated parental behavior that would eventually, through the worst catastrophe in Earth's history, give rise to the mammalian lineage. The Permian world in its middle phase was a world dominated by synapsids on land and by remarkable marine reptiles and fish in the ocean. It was complex, ecologically rich, and apparently stable. But beneath the apparent stability, beneath the living surface of a world that had been evolving and diversifying for hundreds of millions of years, forces were gathering that would bring everything close to ending. To understand what happened at the end of the Permian, you need to first understand the geography of the world as it existed during that period. The continents of the Permian were not arranged as they are today. Over the course of the preceding hundreds of millions of years, the movement of tectonic plates, the slow, grinding, relentless drift of the sections of the Earth's crust on the viscous rock of the mantle below, had brought most of the world's land masses together into a single enormous supercontinent, Pangaea. Pangaea, which means all land in Greek, stretched from pole to pole, a vast, continuous landmass that covered roughly a third of the Earth's surface. It was surrounded by a single enormous ocean, Panthalassa, and the interior of this supercontinent was remote from the moderating influence of the ocean, subject to extreme seasonal temperature swings, deeply arid in much of its central regions. The climate of Permian Pangaea was harsh and variable. The northern hemisphere experienced intensely cold winters and blazing summers. The interior deserts were among the most arid environments on Earth, and only the coastal margins and the equatorial regions offered conditions mild enough to support the rich, complex ecosystems that we have been describing. The diversity of life in the Permian was extraordinary, perhaps the greatest diversity of complex multicellular life that the planet had seen up to that point. The ocean was filled with an abundance of life, coral reefs, brachiopod communities, fish of many kinds, marine reptiles, ammonoids, and nautiloids. The land supported diverse communities of plants and animals, synapsids, primitive reptiles, and all the arthropods and other invertebrates that lived among and beneath them. And then, approximately 252 million years ago, it ended, not quickly, not in a single moment, but in geological terms with horrifying speed. The extinction unfolded over a period estimated at somewhere between 60,000 and 160,000 years, which sounds like a long time until you compare it to the hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history that preceded it. That brief span, over 90% of all marine species went extinct. Up to 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species were lost. The complex, intricate food webs that had been built up over hundreds of millions of years were torn apart, simplified, reduced to their most basic elements. The Earth's biosphere came, in the assessment of some paleontologists, within a frighteningly small margin of collapsing entirely. This was the Great Dying, the Permian-Triassic extinction event. The worst mass extinction in the history of complex animal life. What caused it? The question has been the subject of intense scientific investigation for decades, and the evidence now points with considerable clarity to a single primary culprit, though the mechanism through which that culprit caused so much destruction was complex and involved multiple interacting processes. The culprit was volcanic activity. Not ordinary volcanic activity, not the eruptions of individual volcanoes, dramatic and locally destructive as those can be. This was something on a scale that makes ordinary volcanic activity look trivial. This was one of the largest volcanic events in the history of the planet, a period of sustained, massive, continent-scale eruptions in what is now Siberia, a region where the underlying mantle had developed an extraordinary concentration of heat and magma that eventually forced its way to the surface in a catastrophic, sustained outpouring. The Siberian traps, the geological formation left behind by these eruptions, cover an area of roughly 2 million square kilometers in present-day Siberia. The lava flows are in places several kilometers thick, representing a total volume of magma that is almost incomprehensible. Perhaps 2 to 3 million cubic kilometers of lava erupted over a period of perhaps 1 million years, with the most intense phase of activity coinciding closely with the extinction event. But the lava itself was not the primary killer. The eruptions would have been catastrophic locally, enormous areas buried under meters of lava, ash filling the air for thousands of kilometers downwind. But the extinction was global, affecting organisms in the deepest ocean as much as those on land, and the global reach of the catastrophe requires a global mechanism. The global mechanism was atmospheric. The Siberian traps eruptions released into the atmosphere quantities of gases, primarily carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volcanic gases, that were sufficient to dramatically alter the chemistry of both the atmosphere and the ocean. The carbon dioxide caused warming, a runaway greenhouse effect that raised global temperatures substantially over a period of thousands to tens of thousands of years. The sulfur dioxide caused acid rain. And the warming of the ocean had a particularly devastating secondary consequence. The deep ocean contains enormous reservoirs of frozen methane, held in a crystalline solid form called methane hydrate. Methane hydrates are stable at the low temperatures and high pressures of the deep ocean. But if the temperature of the deep ocean rises sufficiently, the hydrates destabilize and release their methane, and methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. There is evidence in the geological record that this methane release occurred at the end of the Permian, a sudden additional injection of greenhouse gas into an already warming atmosphere, accelerating the warming further in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. The ocean, warming from above and from the release of methane, also experienced a dramatic reduction in oxygen. The chemistry of warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. The circulation patterns that bring oxygenated surface water down to the depths and bring nutrient-rich deep water up to the surface, the ocean's circulatory system, broke down as the temperature gradient between the poles and the equator decreased. The result was widespread ocean anoxia, vast regions of the deep and even the shallow ocean becoming oxygen-depleted dead zones, hostile to the aerobic respiration of virtually every complex animal. and the ocean also acidified. As carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolved into the seawater, it formed carbonic acid, reducing the pH of the ocean. This acidification had devastating consequences for all the organisms that built their shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate, corals, mollusks, echinoderms, brachiopods, because calcium carbonate dissolves in acidic conditions. The reef ecosystems that had been the most biodiverse environments in the ocean simply dissolved. The coral reefs of the Permian, already damaged by the warming and the anoxia, could not maintain their calcium carbonate structures in acidifying water. They died, and the entire complex community of organisms that depended on reef habitat died with them. The result, on the seafloor and in the water column of the Permian Ocean, was an almost complete biological silence. The complex food webs that had been built up over hundreds of millions of years, from the plankton at the base, through the filter feeders and the small invertebrates, up to the large predatory fish and marine reptiles, collapsed from the bottom. Without plankton, the filter feeders starved. Without filter feeders and small invertebrates, the larger predators starved. The ecosystem did not die all at once. It unraveled, level by level, in a cascade of ecological failure that left the ocean, at its nadir, as barren as it had been before complex life first appeared. On land, the story was somewhat different in its details, but equally devastating in its outcome. The warming of the climate estimates vary, but global average temperatures may have increased by 10 degrees Celsius or more at the extinction boundary, was severe enough to have pushed many terrestrial environments beyond the thermal tolerance limits of the organisms living there. Equatorial regions, already warm, may have become effectively too hot for vertebrate life for significant periods, creating a dead zone around the tropics where nothing could survive the lethal temperatures. The plants suffered enormously. The fossil record at the Permian-Triassic boundary shows a dramatic decrease in plant diversity. The complex forests and plant communities of the late Permian are replaced in the rock record by a simple assemblage dominated by opportunistic, weedy species, or in some intervals, by nothing but fungal spores, the fingerprints of decay, of dead organic matter being broken down in the absence of living plant communities. Without plants, the herbivores had nothing to eat. Without herbivores, the carnivores had nothing to eat. The land food web collapsed in the same cascading, level-by-level fashion as the marine food web. The synapsids, which had dominated the land for tens of millions of years, were devastated. The Gorgonopsids, the saber-toothed predators that had been among the most sophisticated predators of the late Permian, went entirely extinct. The diversity of dicynodonts collapsed. The complex, ecologically rich communities of the late Permian were replaced by what paleontologists have described as disaster faunas, simple assemblages dominated by a very small number of generalist species that could survive in a wide range of conditions, thriving in the ecological vacuum left by the extinction. One of the most telling indicators of the severity of the extinction on land is the coal gap, the near-complete absence, in rocks deposited in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, of the organic deposits that normally form coal. Coal forms from the compressed remains of dense vegetation. The absence of coal in the aftermath of the Great Dying tells you that there was no dense vegetation, that the plant communities of the world had been reduced to such a minimal state that they were not producing enough organic material to leave any significant record in the rock. The world at the end of the Permian was as close to biologically empty as it had been since before the Cambrian Explosion. What had taken hundreds of millions of years to build had been, in the blink of a geological eye, brought to the edge of annihilation. And yet, and this is the part of the story that is, in its way, as extraordinary as the catastrophe itself, life survived. Not all of it, not most of it, but some of it did. The same qualities that make life so vulnerable to sudden, dramatic changes in the environment its dependence on intricate ecological relationships, its specialization to particular conditions, its limited physiological tolerance, are counterbalanced by a quality that has proven, over and over again through the history of this planet, to be more fundamental than any of them: its stubborn, irrepressible insistence on continuing. In the darkest depths of the Permian extinction, in the most barren stretches of a world that seemed to have been stripped of everything, there were survivors. Not many, not diverse, but real, breathing, metabolizing, reproducing survivors, organisms tough enough or lucky enough or generalist enough to persist through the worst catastrophe that complex animal life has ever faced. And from those survivors, everything that came after would grow. The survivors of the Great Dying were, almost by definition, generalists. They were the organisms that had not been too specialized for any particular set of conditions, the ones that could eat a variety of foods, that could tolerate a range of temperatures, that could reproduce successfully in degraded environments. In the marine realm, some of the few groups that came through the extinction with significant diversity intact were organisms like certain bivalves, clams, and their relatives, that were relatively tolerant of acidified, oxygen-poor water and could feed on the reduced organic material available to them. On land, some of the cynodont synapsids, the most mammal-like of the pre-mammalian lineages, seemed to have survived, as did some of the dicynodonts and some primitive archosaurs, the group from which dinosaurs, crocodilians, and birds would eventually emerge. These survivors were not inheritors of a rich world. They were inheritors of a devastated one, a planet scraped nearly clean of the biological complexity that hundreds of millions of years of evolution had built. But devastation, as the history of life repeatedly demonstrates, is not the end. It is the opening of a door into ecological space that is suddenly empty, suddenly available, suddenly waiting for whatever organisms are tough enough to step through it. The recovery from the Permian extinction was slow. The early Triassic period, which followed immediately after the extinction boundary, shows a striking pattern in the fossil record: very few species, very simple ecological communities, a prolonged interval of apparently continuing environmental stress in which the recovery that one might expect did not immediately materialize. Something, perhaps continuing volcanic activity, perhaps the slow pace of ocean chemistry recovery, perhaps the ongoing release of greenhouse gases, kept the environment hostile for millions of years after the initial extinction event. But eventually, gradually, life began to fill the empty world again. The story of the recovery from the Great Dying is, in many ways, as fascinating as the story of the extinction itself. Because the organisms that survived, the generalists, the tough ones, the lucky ones, were not simply restoring what had been lost. They were building something new in an ecological landscape that had been fundamentally transformed. The synapsids, which had dominated the land before the extinction, never regained their preeminence afterward. Some of them survived, and some of their lineages would eventually give rise to the mammals that would later come to their own kind of dominance. But the immediate post-extinction period on land was characterized by a group that had previously been relatively minor players: the archosaurs. The archosaurs were a group of reptiles, sauropsids rather than synapsids, that survived the Permian extinction in modest numbers and began, in the early and middle Triassic, to diversify with extraordinary speed into the ecological space left vacant by the extinction. The archosaur lineage eventually split into two great groups: the crocodilian lineage, whose living representatives are the crocodiles, alligators, and their relatives, and the bird lineage, which is to say, the dinosaurs and their descendants. In the Triassic period, which lasted from 252 to 201 million years ago, the archosaurs experimented with a remarkable range of body plans. There were large, heavily armored archosaurs called edosaurs that browsed on vegetation. There were enormous predatory archosaurs called roysuchians that looked, convergently, much like the large theropod dinosaurs that would come later. There were the earliest crocodilian relatives, diversifying in both aquatic and terrestrial niches. And there were, toward the end of the Triassic, the first true dinosaurs, small, bipedal, active predators that were at first just one archosaur lineage among several, nothing immediately suggesting the dominance that they would eventually achieve. The cynodont synapsids, meanwhile, were giving rise to the first true mammals by the late Triassic, small, nocturnal, insectivorous creatures that lived in the shadow of the increasingly diverse and increasingly dominant archosaurs. These first mammals were not, by any measure, impressive. They were small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. They were probably furry and warm-blooded. They probably laid eggs like the modern platypus or gave birth to tiny, undeveloped young like modern marsupials. They were ecologically bit players in a world dominated by archosaurs, but they were there. And they were carrying in their small bodies and their warm blood and their sophisticated nervous systems and their caring for their young, the seeds of everything that would come after the dinosaurs were gone. The ocean, too, was recovering. The marine realm of the Triassic was different from the Permian Ocean that had preceded it. New groups had risen to fill the niches vacated by the extinct ones. Ammonoids, which had come close to extinction at the Permian boundary, had recovered with extraordinary speed, diversifying within a few million years into a profusion of forms that would eventually rival their pre-extinction diversity. New groups of bivalves and gastropods spread across the seafloor. And the marine reptiles, a stunning group that would include the ichthyosaurs, which convergently evolved the streamlined, fish-like body form of modern dolphins, and the long-necked plesiosaurs, diversified in the Triassic Ocean, filling the role of large, active predators. The Triassic world, as it developed through its 50 million years of duration, was still a world in recovery, but it was a recovery proceeding with the same creative energy that the Cambrian Explosion had shown, the same capacity for evolutionary innovation in the face of ecological opportunity. Life, having come so close to extinction, was exploring the empty landscape with the same stubborn insistence on diversification that had always characterized it, and the land was changing, too. The recovery of plant communities, painfully slow at first, was opening up new habitats, new food sources, new possibilities. The first seed plants, the conifers, the cycads, the ginkgos, had appeared in the Permian, and they had, to some extent, survived the extinction. In the Triassic, they spread and diversified, their seeds giving them a reproductive advantage over spore-producing plants in the drier, more seasonal conditions of the post-extinction world. By the Middle and Late Triassic, the terrestrial world was beginning to look recognizable in its ecological structure, if not in its cast of characters. There were large herbivores, the Dicynodont Lystrosaurus, which had been one of the great survivors of the Permian extinction, was widespread in the early Triassic, its herds moving across the barren post-extinction landscape in something resembling the herds of large mammals on modern savannas. There were large predators, the Roysuchians and early crocodilomorphs, at the top of the food web, and in the background, small and unassuming, the first mammals and the first dinosaurs were quietly beginning their long journeys toward future dominance. The world was recovering. The world was rebuilding, and the world, as it had done so many times before, was preparing for yet another chapter in its extraordinary story. The story of life on Earth is not a story of simple progress from primitive beginnings to sophisticated modernity. It is not a straight line from the first microbes to the complexity of the present. It is a story of experiment and failure, of extraordinary creativity and catastrophic destruction, of ecosystems built up over millions of years and torn down in thousands. It is a story that has been written and rewritten in the chemistry of rocks and the bones of ancient creatures, in the genes of organisms living today and the fossils of those long gone. And through all of it, through the glaciations and the mass extinctions, through the volcanic catastrophes and the drying of seas, through the most devastating tests that a hostile universe could devise, life has persisted. Battered, reduced, simplified, but persistent. Carrying forward in the survivors of each catastrophe the potential for the next experiment, the next chapter, the next extraordinary flourishing of complexity and diversity. The story that began in those first warm oceans, with the first uncertain stirrings of chemistry becoming biology, had not ended at the close of the Permian. It had not ended at the close of the Ordovician or the Devonian or any of the other crises that punctuate the history of life like dark interruptions in an otherwise illuminated narrative. It had continued always because life, in all its strange, magnificent, relentless variety, is fundamentally, almost unreasonably hard to kill. And what came next, the age of dinosaurs, the rise of the mammals, the eventual emergence of intelligence and consciousness, those are stories for another time. But they could not have happened without the 4 billion years of struggle and experiment and catastrophe and recovery that preceded them. They are built on the foundation of the lost worlds we have been exploring, the Cambrian seas full of strange, experimental creatures, the Ordovician reefs alive with filter feeders and predators, the Devonian forests and the fish crawling out of them onto land, the Carboniferous swamps loud with giant insects, the Permian world of the sail-backed synapsids, and the quiet, recovering world of the early Triassic, scarred and diminished but alive. Welcome back. If you are just joining us, we encourage you to watch Part 1 first, where we trace the story of life from its very beginnings in the ancient oceans all the way through the catastrophic Permian extinction. In Part 2, we continue that journey into the recovery, the renewal, and the extraordinary rebuilding of a world that had come closer to total biological collapse than at any other moment in the history of complex life. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. There is something deeply instructive about the way life responds to catastrophe. Not inspiring necessarily, not in any simple, comfortable way, but instructive in the deepest possible sense, in the way that only the very long view of history can teach you. When you look at the history of life on this planet across hundreds of millions of years, you begin to understand that catastrophe is not the opposite of life. It is, in a strange and uncomfortable way, one of life's most essential tools. Not because destruction is good, not because the losses are anything other than genuine and absolute, but because in the space that catastrophe creates, in the emptiness left behind when complexity collapses, new complexity will always eventually grow. The world that emerged from the end of the Permian period was not merely diminished. It was, in the most literal sense, a different world. The ocean chemistry was different. The atmospheric composition was different. The distribution of habitats across the surface of Pangaea was different. And the communities of organisms that had to work with those changed conditions were profoundly different, not because they had been transformed by evolution in the brief span of the extinction itself, but because the organisms that remained were a radically filtered subset of what had existed before, selected not for sophistication or ecological specialization, but for the blunter virtues of toughness, tolerance, and generalism. To stand in the early Triassic world, to exist within it as an observer, if such a thing were possible, would have been to experience something simultaneously familiar and deeply wrong. The sun would rise and set with the same rhythm it always had. Water would still flow downhill. The ocean would still respond to the pull of the moon. But everywhere you looked, the living world would seem thin, simplified, emptied out. The reefs that had once formed such complex, three-dimensional habitats in the warm Permian seas were gone. The rich communities of brachiopods and crinoids that had carpeted the seafloor were gone. The diverse forests that had clothed the land were gone, replaced by a sparse, weedy vegetation struggling to establish itself in soils that had been stripped of the complex organic chemistry that healthy soil requires. It was a world of survivors, and survivors, almost by definition, are not the most elegant or specialized representatives of what came before. They are the ones that could eat almost anything, the ones that could reproduce in almost any conditions, the ones that could tolerate wide swings of temperature and chemistry and habitat quality. They were, in ecological terms, the weeds of the animal world, and weeds, as anyone who has ever tried to maintain a garden knows, are extraordinarily good at taking over empty space. The most immediate winner in the post-extinction terrestrial landscape was a creature called Lystrosaurus. If you were to design an animal specifically to survive a mass extinction, you might well end up with something very like Lystrosaurus. It was a Dicynodont, a member of the synapsid group that had been diverse and successful in the late Permian, but it was one of the most generalist and robust members of its group. It was stocky, roughly the size of a large dog or small pig, with a barrel-shaped body, strong limbs, and a blunt, beaked face from which a pair of small tusks protruded. It had no other teeth to speak of. It processed its food with a horny beak, and it could eat almost any plant material available to it, from tough, fibrous vegetation to soft, succulent material near the water's edge. Lystrosaurus survived the Permian extinction, and in the immediate aftermath of that catastrophe, it thrived to a degree that is almost without parallel in the history of vertebrate life. In some early Triassic fossil deposits, Lystrosaurus represents more than 90% of all vertebrate remains found, a degree of ecological dominance that has no equivalent among large animals in the modern world. For comparison, imagine if a single species of medium-sized mammal made up 90% of all land vertebrate specimens found anywhere on Earth. The degree of ecological simplification that this dominance represents is staggering. It tells you not just that Lystrosaurus was successful, but that almost everything else that had previously shared the landscape with it was gone. The Lystrosaurus world was not, to put it plainly, a rich or complex one, but it was alive. And its very aliveness, its insistence on metabolizing, on reproducing, on occupying and modifying and enriching the environment it inhabited, was the essential foundation upon which the recovery of complexity would eventually be built. Recovery from a mass extinction does not happen all at once, and it does not happen smoothly. The early Triassic fossil record shows a pattern that paleontologists find deeply interesting and somewhat puzzling. A prolonged interval of delayed recovery, lasting several million years beyond the extinction event itself, during which diversity remained low and ecological communities remained simple even as conditions gradually improved. This suggests that the damage done by the Permian extinction was not simply a matter of species being killed off, which could in principle be repaired fairly quickly by the diversification of survivors. The damage went deeper into the structure of the ecosystems themselves, into the soil chemistry, the ocean chemistry, the atmospheric composition, the very physical and chemical context within which life operates. The ocean is perhaps where this extended period of stress is most clearly documented. For millions of years after the extinction boundary, the fossil record of marine life shows repeated episodes of anoxia, the return of oxygen-depleted conditions in the ocean that seem to have repeatedly set back the recovery process just as it was beginning. Some researchers have proposed that the ocean, in the early recovery period, was caught in a kind of feedback loop. The warming that the Siberian Traps eruptions had caused had altered ocean circulation in ways that persisted long after the volcanic activity itself diminished, and these altered circulation patterns continued to create the conditions for anoxia even in the absence of new volcanic inputs. The ocean, in other words, was stuck in a damaged state, unable to return to normal circulation patterns quickly. This extended period of marine stress meant that the organisms most dependent on stable, well-oxygenated marine conditions, the reef builders, the complex filter-feeding communities, the large, active predators of the open ocean, were unable to recover quickly even after the immediate crisis had passed. The reefs would not return in anything like their pre-extinction complexity for millions of years. Some ecological functions that had been performed by specific groups before the extinction, the building of complex calcium carbonate reef structures by corals, for instance, were taken over temporarily by quite different organisms, filling the functional role even as the specific actors changed. On land, the situation was somewhat different. The terrestrial environment, while severely damaged, recovered more quickly in some respects, partly because terrestrial ecosystems do not face the same issues of water chemistry that marine ones do, and partly because plants, once they established, could begin rebuilding the soil quality and habitat complexity that animals depended upon relatively quickly. By the Middle Triassic, roughly 10 to 15 million years after the extinction, terrestrial ecosystems were showing signs of genuine recovery, a return of ecological complexity, a diversification of body sizes and ecological roles, the beginning of recognizable food web structures with multiple trophic levels. Among the most important developments of the Triassic recovery period was the diversification of the archosaurs, the reptile group that would come to dominate land, sea, and air during the subsequent Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. The archosaurs had survived the Permian extinction as relatively minor players in a synapsid-dominated world. In the Triassic, with the synapsid fauna devastated and the ecological landscape open, they diversified with extraordinary speed and creativity. The archosaur family tree split early in the Triassic into two great lineages. On one side were the pseudosuchians, the lineage that leads to modern crocodilians. On the other side were the avametidarsalians, the lineage that leads to pterosaurs and eventually to the dinosaurs and their descendants, the birds. In the Middle and Late Triassic, the pseudosuchians were in many ways the more diverse and ecologically successful of the two lineages. They had diversified into an extraordinary range of body plans, far more diverse than the modern crocodilian fauna would suggest. There were edosaurs, large herbivores armored with rows of bony plates along their backs and sides, looking something like armadillos scaled up to the size of small cars. They were abundant enough to leave extensive fossil records across multiple continents, and they presumably played an important ecological role as bulk herbivores in the late Triassic landscape. There were phytosaurs, long-snouted, semi-aquatic predators that looked, with striking convergence, almost exactly like modern crocodilians, right down to the placement of their nostrils on top of the snout and the general proportions of the body. Phytosaurs and crocodilians are not closely related. This similarity is a case of convergent evolution, of two separate lineages independently arriving at the same body plan because it works so well for an ambush predator lurking in shallow water. The phytosaurs occupied the aquatic predator role in Triassic ecosystems, and they did so with apparent success across a wide geographic range. There were the Roysuchians, large, upright walking predators that were among the dominant land predators of the Middle and Late Triassic. Some Roysuchians reached lengths of 6 meters or more, making them formidable apex predators in any ecosystem. Their body plan, bipedal or semi-bipedal, with large heads and serrated teeth, convergently resembles the large theropod dinosaurs that would come later, suggesting that this general body plan for a large terrestrial predator is one that evolution tends to find repeatedly under the right conditions. And there were the early crocodilomorphs, the actual ancestors of modern crocodilians, which in the Triassic were far more diverse and far less aquatic than their living descendants. Some early crocodilomorphs were small, lightly built, fast-running terrestrial predators that looked more like small dinosaurs than like crocodiles. Others were larger and more robust. The diversity of the early crocodilomorph lineage hints at what might have been, what they might have become, if the subsequent history of the Triassic and Jurassic had unfolded differently. But it is the other great archosaur lineage, the avametidarsalians, that demands our most detailed attention, because it was this lineage that produced two of the most spectacular groups of animals in Earth's history before the flowering plants and their associated insects came to define the modern world. The first of these groups was the pterosaurs, the first vertebrates to achieve powered, flapping flight. The origin of the pterosaurs is one of the most persistent mysteries in vertebrate paleontology. Unlike the transition from fish to tetrapods, which is documented in exquisite transitional detail, or the transition from non-avian dinosaurs to birds, which is now supported by an extraordinary fossil record, the origin of pterosaurs appears in the fossil record essentially fully formed, without clear transitional fossils showing the step-by-step development of the wing. The earliest known pterosaurs from late Triassic rocks in Europe and elsewhere are already sophisticated flying animals, with fully developed wings and the lightweight skeleton and enlarged brain regions associated with controlled flight. Whatever their immediate ancestors looked like, whatever evolutionary steps led from a non-flying archosaur to a fully flying pterosaur, those steps are not yet preserved in the fossil record in any detail that science has been able to document. What we do know about pterosaurs is extraordinary in its own right. The pterosaur wing was built on an entirely different plan from that of birds or bats. It was supported primarily by a single enormously elongated fourth finger, with a membrane of skin and muscle stretching from this finger back to the hind limb. This membrane, the patagium, was not simply a sheet of skin, but a complex, internally reinforced structure with fibers running through it in a way that gave it both strength and the ability to change shape during flight. Pterosaurs were not simply gliders, they were active, powered flyers, capable of sustained flight, and some of the evidence from their trackways and bone structure suggests they were reasonably agile in the air. Pterosaurs diversified through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous into a remarkable array of forms, from small, long-tailed early forms to the enormous, toothless giants of the late Cretaceous. The range of sizes achieved by pterosaurs over their 160 million year history is staggering. Some of the smallest pterosaurs had wingspans of less than 25 centimeters, smaller than many modern songbirds. The largest Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives from the very end of the Cretaceous had wingspans of up to 10 or 11 meters, making them the largest flying animals that have ever existed, with estimated standing heights comparable to a modern giraffe. But in the Triassic, the pterosaurs were still in their early diversification, and while they were certainly present and certainly flying, the Triassic skies were not yet dominated by them. That domination would come later in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, as the pterosaur lineage realized more fully the extraordinary potential of vertebrate flight. The second great group of avometatarsalia, and the one that would come to define the subsequent 180 million years of terrestrial ecology, was, of course, the dinosaurs. The origin of the dinosaurs is better documented than the origin of the pterosaurs, though it is still imperfectly understood. The earliest dinosaurs appear in the fossil record in the middle to late Triassic, roughly 230 to 240 million years ago, in what is now South America. Sites in Argentina and Brazil have yielded the remains of some of the oldest known dinosaurs, animals like Aeoraptor, Herrerasaurus, and the slightly later Storikosaurus, that give us our best picture of what the common ancestor of all dinosaurs might have looked like. These early dinosaurs were not impressive by the standards of the later Jurassic and Cretaceous giants. They were small. Aeoraptor was roughly the size of a large dog, about a meter in length and probably weighing only a few kilograms. They were bipedal, they walked and ran on their hind legs, with their forelimbs freed from the demands of locomotion and available for grasping. They had relatively large heads for their body size, with teeth that suggest at least some of them were predators, though the exact diet of the earliest dinosaurs is still debated. What distinguished these early dinosaurs from the other archosaurs they lived alongside was not any dramatic feature of size or specialized anatomy. It was, rather, a set of structural modifications to the hip and leg that gave them a more upright posture and a more efficient gait than their contemporaries. Where many other archosaurs had a somewhat sprawling posture, with the legs extending partly sideways from the body, like those of a modern lizard, the early dinosaurs had their legs directly beneath their bodies, in the same erect posture that characterizes modern birds and mammals. This fully erect posture is mechanically more efficient for walking and running on land, and it may have given the early dinosaurs a significant energetic advantage over their contemporaries. But in the middle to late Triassic, the dinosaurs were not dominant. They were, as we noted in Part 1, just one lineage among several, and not by the evidence of the fossil record, the most abundant or most diverse lineage. The Pseudosuchians, the Roysuchians, and their relatives were, if anything, more successful in the Middle Triassic, more diverse in form, and apparently more widespread. The dinosaurs were present, they were expanding slowly, they were beginning to diversify. But they had not yet achieved dominance. That would change, and the mechanism by which it changed is itself a powerful reminder of the role that catastrophe plays in shaping the history of life. At the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic periods, approximately 201 million years ago, another mass extinction struck the Earth. This event, known as the End-Triassic extinction, was the fourth of the 5 great mass extinctions recognized in the fossil record, and while it was not as catastrophic as the End-Permian event, it was severe enough to reset the ecological landscape in ways that profoundly shaped everything that came after. The cause of the End-Triassic extinction is still being investigated, but the leading hypothesis, supported by a growing body of evidence, is remarkably similar to the cause of the End-Permian event: massive volcanism. In this case, the volcanic activity was associated with the beginning of the breakup of Pangaea. The supercontinent was starting to rift apart, with the Atlantic Ocean beginning to open as the North American and African plates separated. Along the rift zones where this separation was occurring, enormous quantities of lava poured out, creating the geological formation known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history, if smaller than the Siberian Traps. As with the Siberian Traps, the volcanic activity released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, causing warming, ocean acidification, and anoxia. As with the End-Permian extinction, the marine realm was severely affected. The marine reptiles, the ammonoids, the bivalves, the reef communities, all suffered devastating losses. On land, many of the non-dinosaurian archosaurs were severely affected. The Roysuchians, which had been among the dominant large predators of the late Triassic, went extinct. The Ediasaurs went extinct. The Phytosaurs went extinct. The large crocodilomorphs were reduced to survivors. The dinosaurs, by contrast, came through the End-Triassic extinction with their diversity relatively intact, perhaps because they were already adapted to a wider range of conditions, perhaps because they had some physiological advantage over their competitors, perhaps simply because of the chance distribution of extinction. Whatever the reason, the aftermath of the End-Triassic extinction found the dinosaurs in a world that had been cleared of most of their competitors, a world of empty ecological space and untapped opportunity, and the dinosaurs filled that space, rapidly and thoroughly, in what is arguably a second major adaptive radiation comparable in some ways to the Cambrian Explosion. By the early Jurassic, dinosaurs were already dominant on land across most of the world. By the Middle and Late Jurassic, they had diversified into the full range of ecological roles: giant herbivores, apex predators, small omnivores, specialized insectivores that we associate with the dinosaur age. But all of this, the rise of the dinosaurs, the extraordinary biodiversity of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, the eventual emergence of birds from within the dinosaur lineage, that is the story of what came after the period we have been examining. Our story is the story of what came before, and to fully appreciate what came before, it is worth pausing to consider just how different the world was in those earlier periods, and how directly the events we have been tracing led to the world that the dinosaurs eventually inherited. Let us go back then. Back before the End-Triassic extinction, back before the rise of the archosaurs, back to the world that existed before the Great Dying, the Permian world in its full complexity and richness, and examine it more closely, because it deserves to be understood not just as a prelude to catastrophe, but as an achievement in its own right. The late Permian world, in the roughly 20 million years before the extinction, was perhaps the most ecologically sophisticated terrestrial world that had yet existed on Earth. The synapsids had been evolving and diversifying for over 70 million years by this point, and they had produced an array of forms that, in their ecological roles and in some of their physiological characteristics, anticipate the mammal-dominated world of the Cenozoic era in fascinating ways. The dominant herbivores of the late Permian were the Dicynodonts, a group that first appeared in the Middle Permian and diversified into an extraordinary range of forms by the late Permian. Dicynodonts ranged from small, burrowing forms the size of a mouse to large, cow-sized animals that probably traveled in herds across the Permian landscape. They had, by reptilian standards, a very efficient way of processing plant material, a beak-like structure at the front of the mouth for cropping vegetation, combined with a sliding jaw motion that could generate a powerful shearing force, unlike the simple up and down motion of most reptile jaws. This gave them access to a wider range of plant material than their competitors could manage, and it probably contributed substantially to their ecological success. The most widespread and abundant of the larger Dicynodonts in the late Permian was Dicynodon itself, which gave the group its name. It was a robust, barrel-bodied animal, perhaps 1 meter to 1.5 meters in length, with a strong beak and a pair of small tusks, the canine teeth that characterized the group and that were retained even as most other teeth were lost. Dicynodon, based on the distribution of its fossils, was genuinely cosmopolitan. Its remains have been found on multiple continents, suggesting that in the late Permian, before the extinction reshuffled everything, the large herbivore niches of the terrestrial world were filled across Pangaea by this single, highly successful genus and its close relatives. Alongside the Dicynodonts, smaller herbivores occupied different niches. Some of the earlier synapsids, the anomodonts and the more basal therapsids, were still present, though by the late Permian they were declining in diversity as the more advanced groups expanded. And at the very base of the food web, filling the role of small, seed-eating and insect-eating generalists, were forms that we can only glimpse in the fossil record, small, likely nocturnal synapsids that were beginning to show some of the characteristics we associate with mammals: more complex teeth, more sophisticated jaw musculature, possibly some degree of endothermy. The predators of the late Permian terrestrial world were, by any measure, extraordinary. At the apex sat the Gorgonopsids, and they deserve extended attention because they represent one of the most sophisticated and, in some ways, most mammal-like predators of the pre-mammalian world. Gorgonopsids were therapsids, advanced synapsids, that evolved in the Middle Permian and reached their peak diversity and size in the late Permian. They were, in the most basic sense, the wolves and big cats of their time, active, pursuit predators with sophisticated sensory systems and hunting behaviors, capable of taking prey substantially larger than themselves. But they were not mammals, and in their details they retain many features that distinguish them from the mammalian lineage. The most immediately striking feature of Gorgonopsids was their teeth, specifically their enormous canine teeth, which in the largest species projected well below the lower jaw when the mouth was closed, forming the classic saber-tooth profile that has evolved independently several times in the history of predatory vertebrates. In Anostrancevia, one of the largest and most famous of the Gorgonopsids, the saber-like canines could reach lengths of 15 centimeters, devastating weapons for piercing and severing the major blood vessels of large prey. To use these teeth effectively, Gorgonopsids had evolved a jaw mechanism that could open to an extraordinary gape. The jaw could be dropped to an angle of nearly 90 degrees, allowing the saber teeth to be deployed with full mechanical effect. The skull structure of Gorgonopsids shows the beginnings of the temporal fenestrae, the openings in the skull behind the eye socket that become progressively more elaborate in the mammalian lineage, reflecting the increasing sophistication of the jaw musculature. Large Gorgonopsids like Anostrancevia were formidable in size. Some specimens suggest body lengths of 3 to 4 meters, making them larger than most modern large carnivores. They would have been the dominant predators in the late Permian ecosystems of Gondwana, capable of taking prey as large as the biggest Dicynodonts. What makes the Gorgonopsids particularly poignant in retrospect is that they went entirely extinct at the end of the Permian. Not a single Gorgonopsid species survived the Great Dying. A lineage that had been evolving and refining itself for tens of millions of years, that had produced some of the most sophisticated predators the world had yet seen, was simply erased. The saber-toothed body plan would eventually evolve again in the Cenozoic in the mammals, but the specific lineage of the Gorgonopsids was gone, and the world was the poorer for their loss, even if it did not know it. The other great group of late Permian predators that deserves attention is one that, unlike the Gorgonopsids, did survive the extinction, though barely, and in much reduced diversity. These were the Thurosphalians, another group of therapsid synapsids that had diversified in the Middle and Late Permian into forms ranging from small, insectivorous predators to large, robust hunters. The Thurosphalians are interesting not just for their ecological role, but for what they reveal about the pace of physiological evolution in the synapsid lineage. Some Thurosphalians show evidence of secondary palates, bony structures on the roof of the mouth that separate the air passages from the food passages, allowing the animal to breathe and eat simultaneously. This is a feature that we take for granted in mammals. We can chew our food and still breathe through our noses, but it is absent in most reptiles, which must hold their breath while swallowing. The presence of a secondary palate in some Thurosphalians suggests that these animals were processing food more like mammals than like reptiles, chewing rather than simply swallowing whole, and with an air circulation system that could support the higher metabolic rate of an endothermic animal. Were Thurosphalians warm-blooded? This is a question that is genuinely difficult to answer for extinct animals, and the evidence is, as with most questions about soft physiology preserved in bones, indirect. But the bone microstructure of some Thurosphalians shows patterns more similar to those of modern mammals than to those of modern reptiles, suggesting rapid growth rates that might indicate a high metabolic rate. The presence of features like the secondary palate and the increasingly mammal-like skull and jaw structure all point in the same direction, toward a metabolic and physiological sophistication that, while perhaps not yet fully mammalian, was substantially more advanced than anything seen in the more basal amniotes. The Thurosphalians were not the only synapsid group showing this trend toward mammal-like physiology. The Cynodonts, another group of therapsid synapsids, were on the same trajectory, and they are particularly important because they are the group that actually gave rise to the mammals. By the late Permian, Cynodonts had already developed many of the features that we associate with the mammalian grade of organization. Differentiated teeth with distinct incisors, canines and molars adapted for precise occlusion and efficient food processing, a secondary palate, a brain case that suggests an enlarged brain relative to body size, and skeletal features suggesting a more mammal-like posture. One of the most remarkable things about the synapsid evolutionary story, the journey from the early, relatively simple pelycosaurs of the Pennsylvanian to the complex, near mammalian cynodonts of the late Permian and Triassic, is how it illustrates the gradual cumulative nature of major evolutionary transitions. There is no single moment when a non-mammal becomes a mammal. There is no clear line in the sand. Instead, there is a long series of incremental changes, a slightly more complex tooth here, a slightly more enclosed brain case there, a slightly more erect posture, a slightly more sophisticated jaw musculature, that, accumulated over tens of millions of years, transform one kind of animal into another. This gradual nature of the transition is actually one of the things that makes the synapsid fossil record so scientifically valuable. Because the transition is gradual and well documented, scientists can study exactly which features evolved in which order, which changes preceded which, and what the functional significance of each change might have been. They can reconstruct, at least in broad outline, the sequence of events by which a sprawling, cold-blooded, simple-toothed Pennsylvanian pelycosaur became a warm-blooded, complex-toothed, sophisticated Triassic cynodont, and eventually the first true mammal. The first true mammals, defined by a specific set of features in the jaw and ear anatomy, appear in the fossil record in the late Triassic, roughly 225 to 220 million years ago. They were, as we have noted, small. The largest early Mesozoic mammals were roughly the size of a modern rat or small squirrel. Most were smaller, mouse-sized or shrew-sized animals, scurrying through the leaf litter and undergrowth of Triassic and Jurassic forests, eating insects and small invertebrates, almost certainly nocturnal to avoid predation by the increasingly dominant dinosaurs. For the next 160 million years, through the entire reign of the non-avian dinosaurs, mammals would remain small and ecologically marginal. They would diversify quietly. There were, in fact, more species and more ecological diversity among Mesozoic mammals than was appreciated until relatively recently. But they would not achieve the ecological dominance that their ancestors, the synapsids, had enjoyed before the Permian extinction. They would wait in their small warm bodies through the entire age of dinosaurs, surviving by virtue of the same qualities that had gotten the synapsids through the Permian extinction: generalism, toughness, and a metabolic system capable of fueling activity at any temperature. And when the dinosaurs were gone, when the asteroid struck and the sky darkened and the world changed again, the mammals would be there. Ready to step into the empty landscape, ready to diversify into the ecological space that the dinosaurs had vacated, ready to build once more the complex world that catastrophe had temporarily erased. But that, as we have said, is a story for another time. Let us return now to the ocean. Because while the synapsids were doing their extraordinary work on land, building toward mammals, experimenting with warm blood and complex teeth and sophisticated behavior, the ocean was developing its own extraordinary cast of characters, its own ecological dramas, its own experiments in form and function. The Permian Ocean was not the Cambrian Ocean. The 300 million years that separated them had transformed the marine environment as thoroughly as they had transformed the terrestrial one. Gone were the strange, experimental creatures of the Cambrian seas, the Anomalocaris, the Hallucigenia, the bizarre array of body plans that had characterized the first great flourishing of animal life. In their place, the Permian Ocean was dominated by groups that were, in many ways, more recognizable, more clearly related to the marine life that exists today, even if the specific species were utterly different. The Permian reefs were built primarily by rugose and tabulate corals, groups that are now extinct but that functioned ecologically much as modern corals do, colonial animals, secreting calcium carbonate skeletons that accumulated over time into massive, complex, three-dimensional structures, providing habitat for an enormous diversity of other organisms. The Permian reefs were among the most biodiverse habitats in the late Paleozoic ocean, and their destruction at the end Permian extinction was one of the most consequential ecological losses of that event. Brachiopods, the lamp shells, were the dominant shelled invertebrates of the Permian seafloor, filling the role that bivalves, clams, and their relatives would come to fill in the subsequent Mesozoic era. Brachiopods superficially resemble clams, having two shells that they can open and close, but they are entirely unrelated to bivalves. Their internal anatomy is completely different, and they are in fact more closely related to bryozoans and a few other obscure phyla than they are to mollusks. In the Paleozoic, brachiopods were extraordinarily diverse and abundant, often forming the dominant element of seafloor communities in shallow, well-oxygenated marine environments. The Permian extinction devastated them. While brachiopods still exist today, they never recovered their Paleozoic diversity, and the ecological dominance of the seafloor passed in the Triassic recovery period to the bivalves who have held it ever since. Crinoids, the sea lilies, were another extraordinarily abundant group in the Permian Ocean. These are not plants despite their plant-like appearance. They are animals, echinoderms related to starfish and sea urchins, that spend their adult lives anchored to the seafloor or other surfaces, extending their feathery arms into the current to filter plankton. In the Paleozoic, crinoids formed dense communities called crinoid gardens, sometimes covering the seafloor in such density that the rock laid down beneath them is composed almost entirely of their fossil remains, crinoidal limestone, which forms the building material for entire cliff faces and quarried stone formations in various parts of the world. The Permian extinction severely reduced crinoid diversity, though they survived, and a much reduced diversity of crinoids exists in the modern ocean. Among the most interesting members of the Permian marine fauna were the ammonoids, free-swimming, chambered shell mollusks related to the modern nautilus, though with a shell whose internal walls were far more complexly folded and whose external ornament was often dramatically diverse. Ammonoids had first appeared in the Devonian period, and by the Permian they had been through several cycles of near extinction and rapid rediversification, a pattern that would continue through the Triassic and Jurassic until their final extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. The shell of an ammonoid was a marvel of biological engineering. It was divided internally into a series of chambers by walls called septa, and the animal itself lived only in the outermost, largest chamber, using the empty inner chambers, connected by a thin tube called the siphuncle, to control its buoyancy by adjusting the ratio of gas to fluid within them. The outer surface of the shell was often ornately coiled and elaborately sculptured with ribs, keels, and nodules, and the pattern of folding in the internal walls created the complex, distinctive suture patterns that are one of the most characteristic features of ammonoid fossils. Why did the suture patterns become so complex over evolutionary time? This is a question that has intrigued paleontologists for decades. The sutures, the lines where the internal walls meet the outer shell, are more complexly folded in more advanced ammonoid groups, reaching in the Cretaceous a degree of complexity that seems almost excessive for any structural function. One hypothesis is that the complex folding increased the mechanical strength of the shell, that a more elaborately folded internal wall provided a stronger attachment to the outer shell and could withstand greater hydrostatic pressure, allowing the animal to dive deeper. Another hypothesis is that the complex sutures allowed for more flexible shell deformation in response to pressure changes, a kind of built-in stress relief. The debate is not fully resolved, but the complexity of the structure is undeniable. The ammonoids were important not just as ecological players in their own right, though they clearly were, as abundant, active members of the marine food web, but as what geologists call index fossils. Because ammonoid species evolved rapidly, had distinctive shell morphologies that can be identified precisely, and were widely distributed in the ancient ocean, their fossils are extraordinarily useful for dating and correlating marine rock formations. A geologist who finds a particular ammonoid species in a rock formation can tell you, with considerable precision, the age of that rock, often to within 1 million years or less. The ammonoids are in this sense the timekeepers of the Mesozoic ocean, and their story of near extinction and repeated recovery is one of the most dramatic narratives in the entire history of marine life. The marine reptiles of the Triassic and beyond deserve particular attention because they represent one of the most spectacular examples of secondary aquatic adaptation in the history of vertebrates, the return to the ocean of groups whose ancestors had conquered land. Life has made this journey from water to land and back to water multiple times in its history. The ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, the mosasaurs of the later Cretaceous, all of these groups were reptiles whose ancestors had been terrestrial, but which had returned to the ocean and adapted to aquatic life with extraordinary thoroughness. This return is, in evolutionary terms, not as surprising as it might seem. The ocean is a rich and productive environment, and for a vertebrate that is already warm-blooded and capable of sustained activity, it offers opportunities that are largely unavailable to ectothermic fish. The ichthyosaurs were perhaps the most thoroughly aquatically adapted of the marine reptile groups. By the Jurassic, they had evolved a body form of striking convergence with modern dolphins and tuna, streamlined, fusiform, with a large tail fin providing the primary thrust, and limbs modified into flippers for steering and stabilization. They gave birth to live young, as dolphins do, because they were no longer capable of returning to land to lay eggs. Some ichthyosaur species apparently dived to considerable depth, based on evidence from the size of their eyes, the largest eyes relative to body size of any vertebrate, designed to gather maximum light in the dimly lit depths. The plesiosaurs, long-necked, four-finned marine reptiles that appeared in the late Triassic and persisted until the end of the Cretaceous, had a completely different body plan from the ichthyosaurs, and they moved through the water in a completely different way. Where ichthyosaurs used an undulating tail, as fish and dolphins do, plesiosaurs appear to have flown through the water, using all four of their large, wing-like flippers in a coordinated motion similar to that of modern sea turtles or penguins. This is an unusual and apparently quite effective mode of aquatic locomotion, and it clearly served the plesiosaurs well. They were successful for over 135 million years. The long neck of the typical plesiosaur, which in some species included over 70 cervical vertebrae, giving a neck length that could exceed the body length, has been the subject of much discussion and speculation. What was it for? Various hypotheses have been proposed: that the long neck allowed plesiosaurs to reach down to the seafloor for bottom-dwelling prey, that it helped them approach schooling fish from below without the bulk of the body disturbing them, that it was used for display. The full truth is probably complex, and different species may have used their long necks in different ways. But to properly understand the world of the Permian and Triassic oceans, we need to go beyond the specific animals and consider the ocean itself, the physical and chemical environment that shaped everything living within it. The Permian Ocean was, in its chemical composition, quite different from the modern ocean. The ratio of calcium to magnesium in seawater affects which carbonate minerals are most easily precipitated, and this ratio has varied through geological time as seafloor spreading rates and continental weathering patterns have changed. During the Permian and much of the Paleozoic, the chemistry of the ocean favored the precipitation of calcite, the same mineral that makes up the shells of brachiopods, the skeletons of rugose and tabulate corals, and the tests of many other Paleozoic marine organisms. This calcite sea chemistry allowed the extraordinarily productive reef and seafloor communities of the Paleozoic to build their calcium carbonate structures efficiently. The temperature of the Permian Ocean also varied considerably through the period. The early Permian, with its extensive ice sheets at the southern pole, was a world of significant temperature gradients between the poles and the tropics, gradients that drove vigorous ocean circulation, bringing oxygenated, nutrient-rich water up from the depths in equatorial upwelling zones, creating some of the most productive marine environments of the entire Paleozoic. As the Permian progressed and the ice sheets melted, these temperature gradients diminished, the ocean circulation became more sluggish, and the upwelling zones that had nourished such rich communities became less vigorous. This gradual reduction in ocean circulation through the late Permian May itself have contributed to making the ocean more vulnerable to the collapse that occurred at the extinction boundary. An ocean with slower circulation is already somewhat prone to the development of oxygen-poor deep-water zones, the very conditions that became catastrophic during the extinction event. The volcanism of the Siberian traps did not simply strike an otherwise healthy ocean. It struck an ocean that was already, for independent reasons, beginning to show signs of stress. The recovery of the ocean in the aftermath of the Permian extinction is one of the most intensively studied topics in paleontology, precisely because the patterns of recovery illuminate so much about how marine ecosystems function, what makes them resilient, and what makes them vulnerable. And what the fossil record shows is a story of remarkable complexity and surprising contingency. A story in which the identity of the survivors was not simply determined by which groups were ecologically superior or evolutionarily advanced, but by a combination of physiological tolerance, geographic luck, and the specific ways in which different groups' basic biology interacted with the particular stresses of the extinction event. The groups that came through best were, broadly speaking, those that were most physiologically tolerant of the conditions that prevailed during and immediately after the extinction: reduced oxygen, elevated carbon dioxide, higher temperatures, more acidic water. Some bivalve groups, as we noted, were relatively tolerant of these conditions, and they came through the extinction with meaningful diversity intact. Some fish groups survived, those that could tolerate low oxygen conditions, or those that could find refuge in cooler or better oxygenated water. The groups that suffered most were those that were most physiologically constrained, most dependent on stable, well-oxygenated, well-buffered ocean conditions. The corals, which build their carbonate skeletons in a process that is exquisitely sensitive to ocean pH and temperature, were devastated. The brachiopods, which had dominated the Paleozoic seafloor, were severely reduced. The crinoids lost most of their diversity, and the complex multi-level food web that had sustained all of this life simply unraveled, level by level, as the conditions that each level depended upon deteriorated. The process of rebuilding took time, far more time than the extinction itself had required. The timescales of ecological recovery are not symmetric with the timescales of ecological collapse. It is easy to destroy a complex system. It is hard to rebuild one. The components of a functioning ecosystem, the nutrient cycles, the population dynamics, the predator-prey relationships, the physical structuring of habitat by reef-building and burrowing organisms, all have to be reassembled from scratch, and the reassembly requires that organisms be present in sufficient density and diversity to begin establishing the interactions that make an ecosystem more than just a collection of individual species. For the marine realm, the first clear signs of substantial recovery do not appear until the Middle Triassic, roughly 10 to 15 million years after the extinction. The ammonoids recovered first, with their characteristic rapid evolutionary radiation filling the open water column with new species within a few million years of the extinction. The bivalves began their expansion into the roles previously occupied by brachiopods. New groups of marine reptiles appeared. But the reef ecosystems, the most complex and biodiverse marine habitats, were among the slowest to recover, and the reefs of the Middle and Late Triassic were built by different organisms than the reefs of the Permian, primarily by sponges and a group of bivalves called megalodontids, rather than by the rugose and tabulate corals that had built the Paleozoic reefs and which never recovered from the extinction. The world of the Middle and Late Triassic, both on land and in the ocean, was in many ways a transitional world. It was no longer the world of the Permian, with its complex synapsid-dominated terrestrial ecosystems and its rich Paleozoic-style marine communities. But it was not yet the world of the Jurassic, with its dinosaur-dominated landscapes and its ichthyosaur and plesiosaur-patrolled seas. It was something in between, a world in the process of becoming, of assembling itself from the pieces left by catastrophe, experimenting with new combinations of organisms and ecological relationships, testing what would work in the changed environmental conditions. This sense of experimentation is perhaps most vivid in the archosaur fauna of the Middle and Late Triassic. The explosion of archosaur diversity in this period, with pseudosuchians and dinosaurs and pterosaurs all diversifying simultaneously, filling different ecological niches, competing with and displacing one another in patterns that are still not fully understood, gives the Triassic an almost Cambrian quality, a sense of life throwing many different solutions at the problem of how to survive in the post-extinction world and seeing which ones stick. Some of the solutions that evolution tried in the Triassic were, in retrospect, extraordinary dead ends, body plans, and ecological strategies that worked well enough in the Triassic context, but that did not persist into the Jurassic. The Dinosaurs, as we noted, went extinct at the end of the Triassic. The Roysuchians went extinct. The Phytosaurs went extinct. Even within the Archosaur lineage, many of the early experiments, the diverse Pseudosuchian fauna of the Middle and Late Triassic, did not make it through the End-Triassic extinction. What survived was a filtered set, the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, and the crocodilomorphs on one hand, and the various synapsid lineages, including the early mammals, on the other. These survivors were not necessarily the best organisms in any absolute sense. They were the ones that, for whatever combination of reasons, physiological, ecological, geographic, happened to be in the right place with the right characteristics when the End-Triassic extinction struck. The crocodilomorphs, the surviving pseudosuchians, represent a fascinating case study in evolutionary constraint and persistence. In the Triassic, as we noted, early crocodilomorphs were diverse and ecologically varied. Some were terrestrial, some were semi-aquatic, some were small and fast, others were large and robust. The End-Triassic extinction hit them hard, reducing their diversity. In the subsequent Jurassic period, the crocodilomorphs continued to diversify, but they were competing with the rapidly expanding dinosaur fauna, and over time, they seem to have been progressively pushed out of terrestrial niches by dinosaurian competitors. By the Cretaceous, most crocodilomorphs had adopted the semi-aquatic lifestyle that characterizes all living crocodilians, lurking in or near water, ambushing prey that came to drink or wading into shallow water. This lifestyle, while limiting in some ways, proved to be extraordinarily durable. Modern crocodilians, crocodiles, alligators, caimans, and gharials are the survivors of this lineage, animals that have changed remarkably little in their basic body plan for the past 80 million years or more. They survived the End Cretaceous extinction that killed the dinosaurs. They survived the climate changes of the Cenozoic. They are alive today, essentially unchanged, the living representatives of a lineage that stretches back to the Triassic. There is something almost uncanny about the persistence of the crocodilian body plan, its longevity in the face of all the changes that the world has undergone. It suggests that the semi-aquatic ambush predator lifestyle is one of those evolutionary sweet spots, a way of making a living that works across an extraordinary range of environmental conditions that is robust against the kinds of perturbations that have driven other groups to extinction time and again. The crocodilians have outlasted everything. They have outlasted the dinosaurs, the ammonoids, the plesiosaurs, the trilobites, the gorgonopsids, the phytosaurs, and virtually every other group we have discussed in this documentary. They are, in a very real sense, one of evolution's most successful long-term experiments. As we move toward the close of our exploration of these lost worlds, it is worth stepping back and considering what the broad sweep of this story tells us, what themes and patterns emerge from the 4 billion years of biological history we have been tracing. The first and most fundamental lesson is one of scale. The human mind is not naturally equipped to grasp the kind of time we have been discussing. 4 billion years, 500 million years. Even the 270 million year run of the trilobites is a span of time so vast that it exceeds the capacity of ordinary human intuition. When we talk about the Cambrian Explosion, we are talking about events that took tens of millions of years to unfold, events that by human standards are essentially instantaneous, but that by geological standards represent a substantial and complex history. To understand life's story, you have to develop a kind of temporal humility, an acknowledgement that the scales involved are beyond ordinary comprehension, and that within those scales, things happen that seem both impossibly slow and breathtakingly rapid. The second lesson is one of contingency. The history of life is not a predetermined march toward increasing complexity and sophistication. It is a branching, unpredictable process, full of chance events that deflected the course of evolution in ways that could not have been anticipated. If the Siberian traps had not erupted, or had erupted somewhat less violently, the synapsids might never have lost their dominance, and the archosaurs might have remained minor players in a world still ruled by the descendants of Dimetrodon. If the bolide impact that ended the Cretaceous had struck a different part of the planet, or had been slightly smaller, the dinosaurs might still be alive, and mammals might still be small, nocturnal insectivores. These contingencies matter because they remind us that what exists today, including us, is not the inevitable product of some directed evolutionary process, but one possible outcome among many, a path through an almost incomprehensible space of possibilities, shaped as much by catastrophe and chance as by the accumulating wisdom of natural selection. The third lesson is the lesson of resilience, but resilience properly understood, not as some simple tendency of life to spring back to its previous state after disturbance, but as something more complex and more interesting. Life does not recover from mass extinctions by rebuilding exactly what was destroyed. It rebuilds differently, with different organisms filling ecological roles, different communities occupying habitats, different patterns of diversity and specialization. The Triassic Ocean was not the Permian Ocean rebuilt. It was a new ocean, built by different organisms, organized in different ways, doing different things. And in its differences from the Permian, it carried the seeds of the even more different world that would follow. This is perhaps the deepest truth that the fossil record has to tell us, that life is not a fixed thing, not a stable arrangement of species in an unchanging world, but a process, a continuous, never-ending experiment in the possibilities of chemistry and physics and biological organization, conducted in the changing theater of a planet that is itself constantly evolving. The creatures we have met in this documentary, the Anomalocaris patrolling Cambrian seas, the Trilobites with their calcite eyes, the Dimetrodon warming its sail in the Permian sun, the Gorgonopsids with their saber teeth, the first cynodont breathing warm air through a mammal-like nose, they were not stepping stones toward us, not precursors to a more advanced future. They were, each of them, fully realized living things, adapted to their worlds, making their livings in their particular time and place. They were not practice runs for humanity. They were the main event of their time. The story of the early cynodonts is particularly worth dwelling on because it illustrates so beautifully the way that the long-term survivors of the Permian extinction laid the groundwork, not through any foresight or direction, but simply through the accumulation of adaptations for everything that would eventually follow. The cynodonts that survived the Permian extinction were not the most sophisticated members of their lineage. Those were the Gorgonopsids and the most advanced Therophalians, and they died. The surviving cynodonts were more generalist, more adaptable animals that could eat a wider variety of food, that could tolerate a wider range of conditions. Among the most important of these survivors was Thrinaxodon, a small cynodont, roughly the size of a large weasel, known from early Triassic deposits in Antarctica and South Africa. Thrinaxodon is significant for several reasons. First, it survived. It is one of the clearest examples we have of a cynodont making it through the extinction boundary in good numbers, because its fossils are relatively abundant in the early Triassic rocks that follow the extinction. Second, it shows in its anatomy a remarkable concentration of mammal-like features. A secondary palate, a differentiated dentition with distinct incisors, canines, and postcanine teeth, a relatively large brain case, and skeletal features suggesting a semi-erect posture. Third, and perhaps most remarkably, there is evidence that Thrinaxodon was a burrower. Fossils have been found in curled positions within what appear to be ancient burrows, and possibly that it cared for its young in the burrow, a behavior that represents an early manifestation of the parental investment that is one of the hallmarks of the mammalian way of life. Thrinaxodon was not a mammal. But it was so close to the mammalian grade of organization that studying it feels like studying the prototype of something that would eventually become one of the dominant groups on Earth. Everything that made the mammals successful, the high metabolic rate, the parental care, the complex teeth, the sophisticated brain, all of these things had their roots in the cynodont lineage, and Thrinaxodon and its relatives were the carriers of those roots through the most devastating catastrophe in Earth's history. The successors to Thrinaxodon in the Middle and Late Triassic, cynodonts like Cynaegnathus, Diademodon, and the later, more mammal-like forms like Probainognathus, showed a progressive further elaboration of these mammal-like features, a continued refinement of the dentition, the jaw mechanics, the skeletal structure. And eventually, somewhere in the late Triassic, the accumulation of these refinements crossed whatever threshold we choose to define as the boundary between non-mammal and mammal, and the first true mammals appeared. They were, as we have said, small, but they were there. And their presence, the presence of these small, warm-blooded, complex-brained, parentally invested creatures in the undergrowth of Triassic and Jurassic ecosystems, represents the continuation of a story that had begun with the first synapsids of the Pennsylvanian, that had been almost destroyed at the end of the Permian, and that would eventually, after another 180 million years of patient waiting and quiet diversification, produce the extraordinary diversity of mammals that exists in the world today. The plant world, too, was rebuilding in the Triassic, and the changes in vegetation that occurred during this period would eventually have profound consequences for the evolution of the animal life that depended upon it. Before the Permian extinction, the dominant land plants of the equatorial and temperate regions of Pangaea included a distinctive group called the Glossopterids, large, seed-producing trees with tongue-shaped leaves, whose fossils are found across multiple continents in rocks of Permian age. The Glossopterids were the foundation of the Permian terrestrial food web in the southern hemisphere of Pangaea, providing the plant material that sustained the enormous herds of dicynodonts and the smaller herbivores that in turn sustained the Gorgonopsids and other predators. The Glossopterids went extinct at the end of the Permian, completely, with no surviving lineage. In the early Triassic, their ecological role was taken by a much simpler, more opportunistic vegetation, lycopods, ferns, and the early seed plants that had survived the extinction in reduced diversity. As the Triassic progressed, the seed plants, particularly the conifers and the cycads, expanded dramatically, spreading across the recovering landscape and eventually forming the dominant elements of the late Triassic and Jurassic vegetation. The conifers and cycads of the Mesozoic were not the lush, green, rapidly growing forests of the modern temperate zone. They were in many cases slower growing, tougher, more drought-resistant plants adapted to the warmer, more seasonal climate of the Triassic and Jurassic world. Their leaves were often small and tough, their tissues rich in resins and compounds that made them less nutritious and more difficult to digest than the large, soft leaves of some Paleozoic plants. This toughness of Mesozoic vegetation may have placed constraints on the herbivory of the large dinosaurian herbivores that would come to dominate in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, constraints that shaped both the digestive adaptations of those herbivores and the body sizes they needed to achieve in order to process enough food to sustain themselves. The absence of flowering plants, which would not appear until the early Cretaceous, meant that the Triassic and Jurassic world lacked many of the most productive and nutritionally rich plant forms that define the modern terrestrial food web. There were no fruits, no flowers, no rapidly growing, nutrient-rich angiosperms. There were only conifers and cycads and ferns and horsetails, plants that were productive enough to sustain the great dinosaurian herds, but that required the enormous gut volumes and the complex digestive systems that the large sauropods and ornithopods developed. The appearance of the flowering plants in the Cretaceous was, in ecological terms, as transformative as any of the other major evolutionary events we have discussed. It fundamentally changed the nutritional landscape of the terrestrial environment, creating new food resources that drove the diversification of insects, birds, and eventually mammals in ways that are still playing out in the modern world. As we draw toward the conclusion of our journey through Earth's lost worlds, it is worth pausing to consider the ocean one final time, not the ocean of the Permian or the Triassic, but the ocean as a whole, as the persistent, foundational environment that has been the theater of life's longest and most important stories. The ocean today covers about 71% of Earth's surface. It contains about 97% of Earth's water. Its average depth is more than 3,800 meters, and its deepest point, the Mariana Trench, plunges to nearly 11,000 meters. It is, by any measure, the dominant feature of this planet's surface, and it has been the setting for the vast majority of life's evolutionary history. Life originated in the ocean. For the first 3.5 billion years of life's history, all of it was in the ocean. Even after the colonization of land, the ocean has remained the richer, more diverse, more ancient environment, home to far more body plans, far more major animal groups, far more fundamental biological diversity than the land. The ocean that exists today is the result of the same slow, continuous process of geological and biological transformation that has shaped everything else we have discussed. It is different from the Cambrian Ocean in its chemistry, its temperature, its biological community. It is different from the Permian Ocean, the Triassic Ocean, the Cretaceous Ocean. But it is connected to all of them by the same fundamental physical and chemical processes that have governed ocean behavior throughout Earth's history, and by the unbroken thread of biological descent that links every organism living in the modern ocean to the first microbes that inhabited the ancient seas. The coral reefs of the modern ocean, currently threatened by warming and acidification in ways that echo the stresses of the end Permian extinction, are the descendants of the reef-building organisms of the Mesozoic, which were themselves the descendants of the reef-building organisms of the Paleozoic, which were themselves descended from the first colonial organisms that began building calcium carbonate structures in the Cambrian and before. The reefs have been destroyed multiple times. They have recovered multiple times. Whether they can survive the current rate of change is a question that the geological past can inform but cannot answer. The fish that fill the modern ocean, the extraordinary diversity of ray-finned fish, from the tiny gobies that are the most species-rich vertebrate group, to the enormous ocean sunfish and the mighty tunas, are descended from the early ray-finned fish of the Devonian and Carboniferous, survivors of every extinction, diversified beyond anything the Paleozoic ocean ever achieved. The sharks, which have been swimming in Earth's oceans since the Devonian, are among the most enduring success stories in the history of vertebrate life. 400 million years of largely unchanged basic body plan, refined and diversified but fundamentally the same efficient predatory machine. And in the deep ocean, in the oxygen minimum zones and the hydrothermal vent communities and the cold seeps and the abyssal plains, life clings to existence in conditions that would kill the vast majority of organisms that we think of as typical. These extreme deep-sea ecosystems remind us that life, wherever it finds any possible foothold, any available energy source, any combination of temperature and chemistry and pressure within which chemistry can be organized into biological function, will be there. It will find a way. It has always found a way. The story we have told in this documentary across 2 long parts through billions of years of evolutionary and geological history is ultimately a story about possibility. About the extraordinary range of forms that life has taken, the extraordinary range of ecological strategies it has employed, the extraordinary resilience it has shown in the face of catastrophes that, from any human perspective, seem utterly annihilating. The Cambrian seas, full of experimental body plans and the world's first great predators, represented one kind of possibility, the possibility of an ocean filling with complexity from almost nothing, driven by the evolutionary arms race between organisms that could suddenly see each other, that could suddenly eat each other in new and more efficient ways, that were suddenly competing for ecological space with an urgency and intensity that the Ediacaran world had never known. The End-Ordovician Ocean, with its extraordinary diversification of marine life and its great reef communities, represented the possibility of ecological structure and stability, of complex food webs persisting through millions of years, of specialization and co-evolution producing organisms adapted to one another and to their shared environment in ways of extraordinary intricacy. The Silurian and Devonian world, with its great lobe-finned fish in the rivers and estuaries, its first land plants spreading across the barren continents, its early tetrapods experimenting with limbs and lungs at the water's edge, represented the possibility of expansion, of life breaking free from the water that had always confined it and beginning the conquest of an entirely new and previously uninhabited environment. The Carboniferous world, with its vast coal forests and its giant arthropods and its early amniotes beginning to explore the dry uplands, represented the possibility of abundance, of an atmosphere, and a climate so favorable to plant growth that life built up an almost incomprehensible reserve of organic material that would eventually fuel the engines of industrial civilization. The Permian world, with its sophisticated synapsid fauna and its rich reef communities, represented the possibility of complexity achieved, of ecosystems so elaborately interconnected, so richly organized that they seem almost self-sustaining, almost inevitable in their richness. And the aftermath of the Permian extinction, the early Triassic sparse, simplified, struggling world of Lystrosaurus and simple plant communities, and the first, tentative signs of recovery, represented perhaps the most important possibility of all, the possibility of beginning again, of starting from almost nothing and building once more the extraordinary complexity that catastrophe had destroyed. Every creature we have met in this documentary was real. Anomalocaris was real. It patrolled real Cambrian seas. It seized real prey with those extraordinary grasping appendages. Its compound eyes saw a real underwater world 500 million years ago. Hallucigenia was real. It walked on real legs across real Cambrian seafloors, its spines real protection against real predators. The Trilobites were real. They lived and died and evolved for 270 million years in a real ocean that no human eye has ever seen. Dimetrodon was real. It warmed its sail in a real Permian sun and hunted real prey in a real world that vanished 250 million years before the first human being drew breath. They were not our precursors in any simple sense. They were not rehearsals for us, warm-up acts for the main performance of human history. They were the main performance of their own time, the protagonists of their own stories of survival and predation and ecological interaction that unfolded over spans of time that dwarf all of human history and prehistory combined. But they are our ancestors, in the broad sense that matters. The cynodonts that survived the Permian extinction carried in their bodies the lineage that eventually gave rise to the mammals. The early tetrapods that crawled out of Devonian rivers were our ancestors in the most literal anatomical sense. Every bone in the human body is a modification of a structure that first evolved in some ancient fish. The first photosynthesizing microbes that oxygenated the early ocean created the atmosphere we breathe. The first cells that formed in the primordial ocean were the beginning of the unbroken chain of biological descent that connects them to every living thing on Earth today. We are all of us, every human being, every mammal, every bird, every reptile, every fish, every invertebrate, every plant, every fungus, every microbe. We are all the current expression of a process that began 4 billion years ago in a warm ocean on a young planet. We carry in our genes the accumulated wisdom of 4 billion years of evolution. We carry in our bodies the structural legacy of every major transition in the history of life. The first cell, the first eukaryote, the first multicellular organism, the first animal, the first vertebrate, the first tetrapod, the first amniote, the first mammal. We are the current survivors of everything that has come before. We are the living end of a 4 billion-year experiment in the possibilities of chemistry and physics and biological organization. And we are, if the history we have explored in this documentary teaches us anything, temporary. Not in any nihilistic sense, not as a counsel of despair, but in the simple, factual sense that everything changes, that the world is always in the process of becoming something different from what it was, that the organisms that exist today will not be the organisms that exist in another 100 million years, any more than the organisms of the Cambrian still exist today. What will come after us, what will fill the ecological space that our lineage currently occupies, what will build on the foundation that the current biosphere is laying, we cannot know. The history of life does not give us predictions. It gives us patterns and principles and an overwhelming sense of the creative power of time acting on variation. It gives us the humbling knowledge that what seems permanent is temporary, what seems impossible becomes inevitable, and what seems like ending is always, from the perspective of geological time, a beginning. The lost worlds we have been exploring, the Cambrian seas, the End-Ordovician reefs, the Devonian swamps, the Permian landscapes of the synapsids, are lost to us not because they were failures. They are lost because the world changed around them, and the organisms that inhabited them either adapted or went extinct, and the ones that adapted carried forward the legacy of everything that had come before, building the next world on the foundations of the old. That process, that continuous, relentless, creative process of change and adaptation and catastrophe and recovery is still happening. It is happening right now in the oceans and on the land in ways that are both familiar from the geological past and unprecedented in their specific details. Life continues its 4 billion-year experiment, exploring the possibilities of this planet, filling every available niche, responding to every available challenge, failing in some cases and adapting in others, always finding a way. The lost worlds of Earth's deep time are not really lost. They are here, written in the rocks that form the hills and cliffs and riverbeds of the present world. They are here in the genes of every living organism, in the structural legacy of bodies shaped by billions of years of evolutionary history. They are here in the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean, changed by billions of years of biological activity. They are here in the very ground beneath our feet, built of the compressed and transformed remains of organisms that lived and died before any human eye existed to see them. They are here in the story we have been telling, the story of life's long journey from those first uncertain stirrings of chemistry in an ancient ocean, through all the extraordinary experiments of the Cambrian and End-Ordovician and Devonian and Carboniferous and Permian and Triassic, to the world that exists today. It is the longest story ever told. It is the most extraordinary story this planet has to offer, and it is, as far as we can tell, still very far from its end. This concludes Before the Dinosaurs, Earth's Lost Worlds. Thank you for spending this time with us, exploring the extraordinary history of life on this planet before the age of the dinosaurs. The story we have told spans more than 4 billion years, from the formation of the Earth and the origin of life, through the Cambrian Explosion and the rise of complex ecosystems, through the colonization of land and the age of the great synapsids, through the most devastating mass extinction in the history of complex life, and into the slow, extraordinary recovery that laid the groundwork for everything that came after. Every creature we have discussed was real, every ecosystem we have described actually existed, and every transition we have traced is documented in the fossil record, the great library of stone that preserves the memory of a world that no human being has ever seen. Please leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching and what time it is there. We read every comment. And please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any future videos, because the story of this planet, from its ancient beginnings to the present, is one we intend to keep telling, as long as there are people who want to hear it.